Margaret Vale made the biggest gamble of her life when she answered a mail-order bride advertisement from a Montana rancher she'd never met. But nothing prepared her for John Rowan, a man so shattered by grief he'd forgotten how to speak his heart. Trapped together in a blizzard that could kill them both, she'll discover that some silences hide the deepest truths, and some storms can heal what they don't destroy. Stay with me until the end, and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The train's whistle cut through the December air like a mourner's wail, announcing Margaret Vale's arrival at the edge of civilization. She pressed her gloved hand against the frosted window, watching as the sparse buildings of Copper Falls, Montana Territory, materialized through the gathering gloom. The year was 1884, and she had traveled over 2,000 miles to marry a man whose face she'd never seen, whose voice she'd never heard, whose heart remained a complete mystery locked behind 3 tersely written letters. The conductor, a grizzled man with kind eyes and a tobacco-stained beard, paused beside her seat. "Miss Vale, this is your stop, though I'll be honest with you, I wish it wasn't." Margaret turned from the window, her green eyes questioning. "I don't understand." He gestured toward the world beyond the glass. "Storm's coming. Can smell it in the air, feel it in my bones. This'll be the last train through for days, maybe weeks. You sure about this? You could ride on to Helena, wait it out in comfort." She thought of the boarding house room she'd left behind in Philadelphia, with its peeling wallpaper and the constant smell of boiled cabbage. She thought of Mrs. Henderson's dress shop, where she'd spent 6 years stitching other women's wedding gowns while her own prospects withered like autumn leaves. She thought of the pitying looks from the church ladies, the whispered conversations that died when she entered a room, the slowly crushing weight of being 28 and unmarried in a city that had no use for spinsters. "I'm sure," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "Mr. Rowan is expecting me." The conductor nodded slowly, resignation in his weathered face. "John Rowan's a good man. Quiet as a stone, mind you, but decent. He'll keep you safe, if nothing else." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Just be patient with him, miss. He's got reasons for his silence." Before Margaret could ask what he meant, the train shuddered to a halt. The conductor hefted her trunk onto his shoulder with a grunt, and Margaret gathered her carpet bag and the small hat box that contained her mother's wedding veil, the only thing of value she'd brought from her old life. The platform, if it could be called that, was nothing more than a stretch of planked wood already dusted with snow. A handful of buildings hunched against the wind. A general store, a saloon with a crooked sign, a church so small it might have been a child's playhouse, and several structures whose purposes Margaret couldn't immediately determine. A few bundled figures hurried about their business, heads down against the increasing wind. Margaret's city coat, which had seemed so substantial in Philadelphia, proved worthless against the Montana cold. The wind didn't just blow, it attacked, finding every gap in her clothing, every vulnerable inch of exposed skin. Within seconds, her cheeks burned and her eyes watered. She blinked rapidly, trying to see through the tears and the swirling snow. "Miss Vale!" The voice came from directly behind her, so quiet she almost missed it beneath the wind's howl. She turned, and her first thought was that the mountains themselves had taken human form. John Rowan stood at least 6 feet tall, made even larger by the heavy sheepskin coat that enveloped his broad frame. His hat, dusted with snow, shadowed a face that seemed carved from the same granite as the distant peaks, all sharp angles and weathered planes, a jaw that looked like it could break stone, and eyes the color of a winter sky. Those eyes met hers for the briefest moment before sliding away, as if sustained contact might burn him. "Mr. Rowan?" Margaret's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. He nodded once, a movement so slight she might have imagined it. Without a word, he reached for her trunk, lifting it as though it weighed nothing at all. His other hand extended toward her carpet bag. "I can carry—" she began, but he was already taking it, his calloused fingers careful not to touch hers in the transfer. "Storm's close," he murmured, the words barely audible. Then he turned and began walking toward a wagon hitched to 2 massive draft horses, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Margaret stood frozen, and not just from the cold. This was the man she'd traveled across a continent to marry? This silent mountain of a man who couldn't even meet her eyes? The letters he'd sent had been brief, yes, but they'd been clear and carefully written. They'd spoken of a home, of honest work, of a future. They'd given her hope. But now, facing the reality of him, that hope felt as fragile as the snowflakes melting on her eyelashes. The conductor appeared at her elbow, carrying the last of her belongings. "Best not keep him waiting, miss. John's right about the storm." She had no choice. She'd spent her last coins on the train ticket. She had no family to return to, no home waiting in Philadelphia. She'd burned her bridges as thoroughly as winter burned the prairie grass. Margaret pulled her inadequate coat tighter and followed her silent bridegroom to the wagon. John had already secured her trunk in the back. He stood beside the wagon, one massive hand extended to help her up. Margaret placed her gloved hand in his, and even through the layers of fabric, she felt the careful strength in his grip. He lifted her onto the bench as though she weighed no more than a child, then released her immediately and moved around to his own side. The wagon seat was narrow. When John settled beside her, his shoulder pressed against hers, solid as oak. He pulled a heavy buffalo hide from beneath the seat, and without looking at her, draped it over her lap and legs. The gesture was awkward, almost embarrassed, but the hide was warm and surprisingly soft. "Thank you," Margaret said. He nodded again, that same barely there movement, and gathered the reins. With a soft click of his tongue, the horses began to move. Copper Falls disappeared behind them almost immediately, swallowed by the white. The wind grew stronger, more vicious, driving snow into their faces. Margaret ducked her head, trying to shelter behind John's broad back. She wanted to ask how far they had to travel, whether they'd make it before the full storm hit, what waited for her at the end of this white road. But the set of his shoulders, the rigid way he held himself, told her that questions would not be welcome. So she sat in silence, holding tight to the bench as the wagon jolted over the frozen ground. Time became strange. It might have been minutes or hours. The world narrowed to the span between one breath and the next, the space between one heartbeat and the following one. Snow gathered in the folds of the buffalo hide. Her fingers, even inside her gloves, grew numb. Just when Margaret thought she couldn't bear another moment of the cold, of the silence, of the uncertainty, John spoke. "There." She looked up, following the direction of his gaze. Through the thickening snow, she could just make out a dark shape, a cabin, substantial and square, with smoke rising from a stone chimney. Beside it stood a barn and what looked like a smaller outbuilding. Even in the storm, even through her exhaustion and fear, Margaret felt a flutter of something that might have been relief. The horses knew their way home. They quickened their pace, and within minutes John was pulling them to a halt before the barn. He set the brake, then turned to Margaret for the first time since they'd left town. "Go to the house," he said, his voice rough, as though speech required great effort. "Doors open. I'll see to the horses." "I can help. Go." It wasn't harsh exactly, but it left no room for argument. "Storm's here." And it was. As Margaret climbed down from the wagon, John's hand steadying her for a brief, careful moment, the wind hit with renewed fury. The snow no longer fell. It flew sideways, erasing the world. She could barely see the cabin, though it was only yards away. Margaret ran, her city boots slipping on the icy ground, her skirts tangling around her legs. The cabin door opened easily, as John had promised, and she stumbled inside, gasping. The warmth hit her like a physical thing, so sudden and intense it was almost painful. Her frozen cheeks burned, her fingers throbbed. The cabin was a single large room with a loft visible above. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames dancing behind a protective screen. A table, 2 chairs, and a rocking chair made up the sparse furniture. In the far corner, a door stood partially open, revealing a bedroom beyond. Everything was clean, almost austically so. No decorations, no softness, no sense that anyone truly lived here rather than merely existing within these walls. Margaret moved closer to the fire, pulling off her gloves with clumsy fingers. She heard John's heavy footsteps on the porch. Then he was there, carrying her trunk like it weighed nothing. Snow clung to his coat and hat, transforming him into a figure from a winter legend. He set the trunk down near the bedroom door, then straightened. For a moment he simply stood there, snow melting in small puddles around his boots, looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Then, In that quiet voice that seemed to cost him something to use, he said, "Bedroom's yours. There's a stove in there for warmth. I sleep in the loft." Margaret blinked. "But we're to be married." "When you're ready." He pulled off his hat, revealing dark hair touched with premature gray at the temples. "Not before. You're safe here, Miss Vale. I give you my word on that." Something in her chest loosened slightly. She'd been so afraid of this moment, of what he might expect, of how this first night might unfold. "Thank you, Mr. Rowan." "John," he said. "Just John." He hung his hat on a peg by the door, then his coat. Beneath, he wore simple work clothes, canvas pants, a flannel shirt that had seen many washings, suspenders. Without the heavy coat, he looked somehow more human, less like a mountain-made flesh. "You hungry?" The question surprised her. Yes, actually. I haven't eaten since this morning." He nodded and moved to the kitchen area, a cast-iron stove, a dry sink, shelves holding basic supplies. His movements were efficient, economical, the actions of a man long accustomed to caring for himself. He built up the fire in the stove, set a kettle to boil, unwrapped what looked like a loaf of bread and a pot of stew. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the table. Margaret sat, watching him work. He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, each action purposeful and sure. Within minutes, he'd set before her a bowl of hearty venison stew and thick slices of bread with butter. He poured tea, real tea, not the chicory substitute she'd grown accustomed to in Philadelphia, and then, to her surprise, he sat down across from her with his own bowl. They ate in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than in the wagon. Here, with the storm raging outside and the fire crackling warm, the quiet felt almost companionable. Margaret studied him covertly between bites. His hands, she noticed, bore old scars, white lines across the knuckles, a burn mark on his left wrist. Working hands. Capable hands. When she'd finished, the stew was surprisingly good, rich and well-seasoned. John rose and took both bowls to the sink. He poured hot water from the kettle and began washing the dishes with the same methodical care he'd shown in their preparation. "I can do that," Margaret said, standing. "Please, let me help." He paused, seeming to consider. Then slowly he nodded and moved aside. Margaret came to stand beside him, taking the clean dishes he handed her and drying them with a cloth. They worked together without speaking, and gradually Margaret felt some of the day's tension beginning to ease. When the last dish was put away, John moved to the fireplace and added 2 more logs. The flames leaped up, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He remained there, one hand on the mantel, staring into the fire as though it might hold answers to questions he couldn't voice. Margaret noticed something she'd missed before: photographs on the mantel shelf. She moved closer, curiosity overcoming caution. There were 3 frames. The first held a photograph of a smiling young woman with soft features and kind eyes, holding a baby. The second showed the same woman, older now, standing beside John, a younger John with less gray in his hair and something like happiness in his face. In his arms, he held a small boy, perhaps 4 years old. The third frame held only a pressed flower, a wild rose, faded but carefully preserved. Margaret's breath caught. She looked at John, at the rigid set of his shoulders, at the white-knuckled grip he had on the mantel, and suddenly she understood. The conductor's words echoed in her memory. He's got reasons for his silence. "Your family," she said softly. It wasn't a question. John's jaw tightened. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Sarah, my wife, and Thomas, our son." What happened? He shook his head, still not looking at her. "Not tonight. I can't. Not tonight." Margaret wanted to press, wanted to know what had carved such deep channels of grief into this man's face, but something in his voice, the raw edge of pain barely contained, stopped her. Instead, she said simply, "I'm sorry for your loss." He nodded, that minimal movement she was beginning to recognize as his primary form of communication. Then he straightened, forcing his shoulders back. "You should sleep. It's been a long day." "Yes," Margaret agreed, though she wasn't sure sleep would come easily, not with the storm's fury and the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on her. "Good night, John." "Night," he murmured, and finally, briefly, his eyes met hers. In that moment, Margaret saw past the wall of silence, saw the man beneath the grief, and saw that he was drowning. The bedroom was small but adequate, containing a brass bed with a thick quilt, a dresser, a washstand, and a small pot-bellied stove that John had already lit. The warmth was wonderful after the cold of the journey. Margaret's trunk sat at the foot of the bed, waiting to be unpacked. She changed into her nightgown with trembling fingers. Whether from cold or emotion, she couldn't say. The bed, when she finally slipped between the covers, was soft and surprisingly comfortable. She could hear John moving around in the main room, the quiet sounds of him banking the fire, checking the door, climbing the ladder to the loft. Then silence, broken only by the wind's howl and the occasional pop from the stove. Margaret lay in the darkness, trying to process everything that had happened in the past 12 hours. She'd left Philadelphia as Margaret Vale, spinster seamstress, a woman the world had dismissed as unnecessary. She'd arrived in Montana as, what? A mail-order bride who hadn't yet been claimed? A housekeeper? A stranger sharing space with another stranger? The wind screamed, and she thought about the woman in the photographs. Sarah. Had she slept in this bed? Had she woken to John's quiet presence, to the knowledge that she was loved? What would she think of Margaret, this interloper sleeping where she once slept? And John? What torment kept him awake in the loft above? What memories haunted him on nights when the wind howled like this? Margaret pulled the quilt tighter and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would bring answers, or it wouldn't. For now, she was warm, she was safe, and she was somewhere utterly different from Philadelphia. That would have to be enough. The storm hit in full force just before dawn. Margaret woke to a world transformed into white fury. The wind didn't howl anymore. It shrieked, a living thing trying to tear the cabin apart board by board. Snow pressed against the window, blocking out all light. She dressed quickly, shivering despite the warmth from the stove, and emerged from the bedroom to find John already up. He stood at the window, fully dressed, staring out at the white chaos with an expression that sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with temperature. "How long will it last?" she asked. He turned, seeming unsurprised by her presence. "Days, maybe a week. I've seen worse." He paused, then added, "But not much worse." The implications of that settled over Margaret like a weight. They were trapped here, cut off from the world, two strangers forced into proximity by weather and circumstance. The cabin that had seemed adequate last night now felt very small indeed. "What do we do?" she asked. John's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "We survived, Miss Vale, same as always." "Margaret," she said, "if we're going to be trapped together, you should call me Margaret." He considered this, then nodded. "Margaret." Her name in his deep voice sounded strange, almost foreign, but not unpleasant. "Coffee's ready, and I'll need to check on the horses soon." "In this?" Margaret moved to the window, pressing her hand against the icy glass. She could barely see 3 feet beyond it. "Is that safe?" "Got a rope strung from the house to the barn for storms like this. Follow the rope, you can't get lost." He poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. Their fingers brushed in the transfer, and she felt the calluses on his palm, the warmth of his skin. "Learned that lesson the hard way?" Margaret wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his face told her it was another story for another time. She sipped her coffee, strong and black, the way men drank it, and tried not to cough. John noticed. "Too strong?" "No," she lied, then relented at his knowing look. "Perhaps a bit. I'm used to tea." He took her cup without a word and returned it a moment later, diluted with hot water and a splash of milk from a sealed jar. The gesture was small, but it struck Margaret as significant somehow, this silent man paying attention, making adjustments without being asked. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and pulled on his heavy coat. "Might be gone an hour. Horses need feeding, water needs breaking up. Cow's out there, too. She'll need milking." "You have a cow?" Margaret didn't know why this surprised her, but it did. It seemed such a domestic detail for this rough, solitary man. "Fresh milk's useful," John said simply. He pulled on thick gloves, then wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes showed. At the door, he paused. "Bar this behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks." That's how you'll know it's me. Are we in danger? Margaret's heart began to race. No, but storms make animals desperate. Bear came through 2 winters back, tried to break in. Just be careful. He opened the door and the storm tried to force its way inside, bringing a blast of snow and wind that made Margaret gasp. Then John was gone, pulling the door shut behind him with effort. Margaret dropped the heavy wooden bar into place and stood there, listening to the wind, feeling more alone than she'd ever felt in her life. At least in Philadelphia, she'd been surrounded by people, by the noise and bustle of city life. Here, there was only white silence and the howling storm. She turned back to the cabin, surveying her domain. John was right. They needed to survive. And survival meant keeping busy. The next hour passed in a flurry of activity. Margaret explored the cabin properly for the first time, taking stock of supplies and making mental notes. The pantry held basics: flour, salt, sugar, dried beans, preserved vegetables in jars. Not luxurious, but adequate. There was a barrel of apples beginning to soften, and several wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth. A ham hung from a hook in the corner, and strips of dried venison filled a tin. She swept the floor, finding the corn broom behind the door. She washed the breakfast dishes and wiped down the table. She added wood to both stoves, careful to place the logs just as she'd seen John do. She was examining the pantry, wondering about making bread, when she heard it. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks. Margaret hurried to the door and lifted the bar. John stumbled inside, covered in snow from head to boot, ice clinging to his scarf. She pushed the door closed behind him and dropped the bar back into place. "Are you all right?" she asked as he unwrapped the scarf with stiff fingers. "Fine." But his face was red where the skin showed, his movements slow and careful. He'd been out there longer than an hour. "What happened?" "Cow was down. Had to get her up. Check for frostbite." He pulled off his gloves, and Margaret saw that his hands were bright red, the knuckles cracked and bleeding slightly. "She'll be all right. Horses, too." "Your hands," Margaret said, moving closer. "Let me see." He tried to pull away, but she caught his wrist, gently but firmly. His skin was ice cold, the cracks weeping thin lines of blood. Without thinking, Margaret pulled him toward the kitchen, poured warm, not hot, water into a basin, and guided his hands into it. John hissed through his teeth but didn't pull away. "It's nothing," he said. "It's not nothing. You'll get infected." Margaret found a clean cloth and, when his hands had warmed sufficiently, dried them carefully. The cracks weren't deep, but they needed attention. "Do you have salve? Bandages?" He gestured toward a cabinet with his chin. "Medicine supplies. Top shelf." Margaret found what she needed: a tin of strong-smelling salve and strips of clean cloth. She worked carefully, applying the salve to each crack and split, then wrapping his hands in loose bandages. John sat perfectly still throughout, watching her with an intensity that made her nervous. "There," she said when she'd finished. "Try to keep them dry for a few hours." "Thank you." The words were quiet, but sincere. He looked down at his bandaged hands, flexed his fingers experimentally. "You've done this before." "My father was a farrier in Philadelphia. He was always cutting or burning himself. I learned young." The memory brought an unexpected sting of tears. Her father had died 5 years ago, followed by her mother the next winter. She blinked the tears away quickly. "You should change into dry clothes. I'll make us something to eat." John nodded and climbed the ladder to the loft. Margaret heard him moving around up there, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of fabric. She focused on the kitchen, on the immediate and practical task of cooking. She found eggs, fresh ones, still slightly warm, in a basket John must have brought in. There was bacon in the cold box and the bread from last night. By the time John climbed back down, dressed in dry clothes with his hair damp and finger-combed, Margaret had a simple breakfast ready. They ate together at the table, the storm still raging outside, and this time Margaret broke the silence. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. "How long have you had it?" John chewed slowly, considering. 8 years. Bought it with money from working cattle drives, plus some Sarah brought from her family. Built the cabin that first summer, barn the next spring. We planned to... He stopped, jaw tightening. "We had plans." "She was beautiful," Margaret said softly. "In the photographs." "She was." John stared down at his plate. Beautiful and kind and patient, with a man who didn't know how to talk much, even then. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "She could fill a silence like nobody else. House felt alive when she was in it. Now it's just empty," Margaret finished when he couldn't. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw real connection in his eyes. "Yes." They finished breakfast in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who've shared a moment of truth. When the dishes were washed and put away, John moved to his chair by the fire and picked up a book. Not poetry, as Margaret had half expected, but a thick veterinary manual. He read with the same intense focus he brought to everything else, occasionally making notes on a scrap of paper beside him. Margaret found her carpetbag and pulled out the mending she'd brought from Philadelphia, Mrs. Ad's. Henderson had given her several pieces to work on during the journey, payment for the years of service. She settled in the rocking chair, Sarah's chair, she thought, then pushed the thought away, and began to work. The day passed in this quiet rhythm. John read, occasionally rising to tend the fire or check the windows. Margaret sewed, her needle moving in and out in the meditative pattern she'd known since childhood. They spoke little, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, some of the tension began to ease from the air. Late in the afternoon, John put down his book and stood. "Need to check the animals again." "I'll come with you," Margaret said, setting aside her mending. He frowned. "It's dangerous." "You'll be holding the rope. I'll hold on to you. I'd like to see the barn, meet the animals properly." When he still hesitated, she added, "Please, John, I'm going to be living here. I should know my way around." He considered this, then nodded slowly. "All right, but stay close. Don't let go of me for any reason." They bundled up, John wrapping Margaret in one of his spare coats, which nearly swallowed her whole, and winding a thick scarf around her face. At the door, he took her hand firmly in his and pulled it through the crook of his arm. "Hold tight," he said, "and keep your head down." The storm hit them like a wall. Margaret gasped, her breath stolen by the wind. Snow stung every inch of exposed skin. She couldn't see John, couldn't see anything but white. Only his solid presence beside her, the rope in his hand, kept her tethered to reality. They moved forward into the blizzard, and for the first time Margaret understood why John spoke so little. In a world like this, words were useless. Only action mattered, only survival. The barn appeared suddenly, a dark shape materializing from the white. John pulled open the door and they stumbled inside, gasping. The contrast was shocking, the howling wind outside, the sudden quiet within. The barn smelled of hay and horses and warm animal bodies, and to Margaret, it smelled like sanctuary. Two massive draft horses occupied the first two stalls, the same pair that had pulled the wagon from town. They nickered softly at John's approach, clearly pleased to see him. In the third stall, a brown and white cow chewed her cud placidly, utterly unbothered by the storm raging outside. "This is Duke and Duchess," John said, indicating the horses. He produced apples from his coat pocket and fed them each one, his bandaged hands moving gently over their velvet noses. "And that's Clover." Margaret approached the horses cautiously. She'd seen plenty of horses in Philadelphia, of course, but these were different. Massive creatures with feet the size of dinner plates and kind, intelligent eyes. Duchess turned to regard her, and Margaret reached out tentatively to stroke her nose. "She's beautiful," Margaret said. "Good horses, strong." Sarah named them, said a duke needed a duchess. John's voice caught slightly on his wife's name, but he continued. Clover was Thomas's project. He was supposed to learn to milk her, take care of her, was excited about it. "How old was he?" Margaret asked softly. "When he... 5. Just turned 5. John moved to Clover's stall and began the process of milking with practiced efficiency. Fever took them both. Late winter, storm like this one. Sarah first, then Thomas 3 days later. I couldn't... His hand stilled on the bucket. "Couldn't get to town for the doctor. Storm had the trails blocked for near a week. By the time I could ride out..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Margaret came to stand beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He flinched at the touch, then relaxed slightly. "That's why you were afraid," she said. "Last night, when you looked at the storm, you were remembering." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They stood there in the quiet barn, the only sounds the soft munching of the animals and the muted howl of the wind. Finally, John cleared his throat and continued milking. "Should get back," he said when he'd finished. "Storm's getting worse." The journey back to the cabin was even more harrowing than the journey out. The wind had picked up, if that was possible, and the snow fell so thick that Margaret couldn't draw breath without inhaling ice. She clung to John's arm with both hands, her face buried against his shoulder, trusting him completely to guide them home. When they finally stumbled through the cabin door, both were shaking with cold and exhaustion. John barred the door while Margaret collapsed into a chair, her teeth chattering. He brought her a blanket and a cup of coffee, prepared without being asked, the way she liked it, and stood by the fire until some color returned to his face. "Thank you," Margaret said when she could speak without her teeth chattering, "for showing me, for trusting me enough to come out there with you." John looked at her and something in his expression shifted. "You didn't have to come. Most women wouldn't have wanted to." "I'm not most women," Margaret said, "and this is my home now too. I should know it." "Your home," he repeated, as if testing the words. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. "Yeah, I suppose it is." That night they cooked together, Margaret preparing vegetables while John seasoned a roast from the cold box. They moved around the small kitchen with increasing ease, learning each other's rhythms. When John reached past her for the salt, Margaret didn't flinch. When she needed to access the pantry behind him, he shifted without being asked. They ate at the table, the storm still raging, and this time John asked questions. Where had she grown up? What had brought her to Montana? What did she hope to find here? Margaret answered honestly, telling him about the loneliness of Philadelphia, the years of watching other women marry while she remained behind, the slowly crushing weight of being unwanted. She told him about Mrs. Henderson's shop, about the endless parade of wedding gowns she'd sewn for other brides, about the small advertisement she'd found in the newspaper one desperate evening. "You answered my letter," John said. "Why?" "Because you were honest," Margaret replied. "You didn't promise love or romance. You promised a roof, a future, and honest work. After all the pretty lies I'd heard from men in Philadelphia, promises they had no intention of keeping, your honesty was refreshing." John nodded slowly. "I can't promise love. Don't know if I've got that left in me, but I can promise the rest, and I can promise I'll never lie to you." "That's enough," Margaret said, and meant it. "For now, that's enough." They washed the dishes together, and Margaret found herself humming, an old song her mother used to sing, something about sailors and storms and finding safe harbor. She didn't realize she was doing it until John spoke. "That's pretty. What is it?" She told him, and he listened with the same intense focus he brought to everything. When she'd finished, he said, "Sarah used to hum when she worked, different songs, but the same kind of peaceful sound. I'd forgotten how much I missed that." It wasn't quite a compliment, but it felt like one. Margaret smiled and continued humming as she dried the last plate. That night, alone in the bedroom, Margaret finally unpacked her trunk properly. She hung her few dresses in the wardrobe, placed her underthings in the dresser, set her hairbrush and hand mirror on the washstand. She pulled out her mother's wedding veil, still wrapped in tissue, and held it for a long moment before carefully placing it in the bottom drawer. In the main room, she could hear John moving around, banking the fire, checking the door one last time. His footsteps on the ladder, the creak of the loft floor, the sounds of another person, of not being alone. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, Margaret felt something she hadn't expected to feel. The smallest, most fragile beginning of peace. The second day of the storm dawned gray and merciless. Margaret woke to the sound of wind battering the cabin walls with renewed fury, as though the storm had spent the night gathering strength for a fresh assault. She lay in bed for a moment, listening to the familiar creaks and groans of the cabin settling, the distant sound of John already moving in the main room. When she emerged, fully dressed with her hair pinned back, she found him standing at the window with his coffee, staring out at the white chaos with that same haunted expression she'd seen yesterday. But today, when he heard her footsteps, he turned and something that might have been a smile ghosted across his face. "Morning," he said, and handed her a cup of coffee already prepared the way she liked it, mostly milk, lightly sweetened with a precious spoonful of sugar. You remembered, Margaret said, surprised and oddly touched by the small gesture. Not much else to do but pay attention, John replied. But there was no bitterness in his tone. He moved to the stove where a pot of oatmeal bubbled gently. Hope you like oats. Winter diet gets monotonous. I've eaten worse, Margaret assured him, thinking of the thin gruel that had been her breakfast staple in Philadelphia. Much worse. They ate together at the table, and Margaret noticed that John's hands, though still bandaged, moved with less stiffness this morning. The salve had done its work. When he caught her looking, he flexed his fingers self-consciously. Better, he said. Thank you for yesterday. You don't need to keep thanking me for small kindnesses, John. We're partners in this, aren't we? The word seemed to surprise him. Partners? Yeah, I suppose we are. He was quiet for a moment, then added, Sarah used to say something similar, that marriage was a partnership, not a kingdom with one ruler. Margaret set down her spoon carefully. Do you want to talk about her? About them? John's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he'd retreat back into silence. But then, slowly, he began to speak. Met her in town, at the general store. She was visiting from Helena, staying with her aunt. I'd come in for supplies, and she was there trying to lift a sack of flour. Shopkeeper wasn't helping. He was busy with some rancher arguing about prices, so I helped her. John stared down at his oatmeal, but Margaret could tell he wasn't seeing it. He was somewhere in the past, reliving a moment 8 years gone. She thanked me, and I couldn't stop looking at her. She had this smile that made you feel like you'd done something worthwhile just by existing. She sounds wonderful, Margaret said softly. She was. Too good for me, everyone said so. But she didn't seem to care. We courted for 3 months, longest 3 months of my life. Then we married in that little church in Copper Falls. Reverend Parker did the service. Thomas came along a year later, and for a while everything was... He trailed off, his throat working. Everything was perfect. Margaret reached across the table and laid her hand over his bandaged one. He stiffened at first, then slowly turned his hand palm up, allowing her touch. The fever came on fast, John continued, his voice rough. January storm, much like this one. Sarah complained of feeling tired, then by evening she was burning up. I rode to town the next morning, but the doctor was out at another ranch, emergency with a breech birth. By the time I got back, Thomas was sick too. And the storm hit that night, worst I'd ever seen. 3 feet of snow in 12 hours, drifts twice that high. His hand tightened around Margaret's, almost painful, but she didn't pull away. I did everything I could. Cold compresses, every remedy I knew. Sarah was strong, she fought it. But Thomas was so small and the fever just kept climbing. I couldn't leave to get help. The snow was too deep, the wind too strong. I'd have died in the attempt, and then they'd have been alone. His voice broke. Sarah knew. On the 3rd day, she knew she wasn't going to make it. She made me promise to keep living, to not let this place become a tomb. Then she asked me to take care of Thomas, and I promised her that too. Tears streamed down Margaret's face, but she remained silent, letting him speak. She died that night, just slipped away while I was holding her hand. Thomas lasted 2 more days, calling for his mama, asking why she wouldn't wake up. I didn't know how to tell him she was gone. So I lied to my dying son, told him she was just sleeping, that she'd wake up soon. John's voice had dropped to barely a whisper. He died believing that lie, died waiting for his mother to wake up and take care of him. Oh, John, Margaret breathed. She stood and moved around the table, pulling his head against her shoulder in an awkward but genuine embrace. He remained rigid for a moment, then his arms came up around her waist and he held on, shaking with silent sobs. They stood like that for several minutes, the storm howling outside, while John finally allowed himself to grieve in another person's presence. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were red but somehow clearer, as though releasing the story had released some of the poison it contained. I'm sorry, he said roughly. Didn't mean to. Don't apologize, Margaret said firmly. Not for grief, never for that. He nodded, wiping his face with the back of his hand. Haven't told anyone the whole story. Not even the Reverend. People in town know Sarah and Thomas died, but not the details. Not how I failed them. You didn't fail them, Margaret said, returning to her seat but keeping her hand on his. You did everything humanly possible. The storm, the fever, those things were beyond your control. You can't blame yourself for acts of God. Sarah said the same thing near the end, made me swear I wouldn't carry guilt for something I couldn't prevent. He laughed bitterly. I promised her that too. Seems I'm not very good at keeping my word. Then keep it now, Margaret urged. Honor her memory by living, by not letting this cabin become the tomb she feared. That's what she would have wanted, isn't it? John looked at her with something like wonder in his eyes. How are you so wise? I'm not wise. I'm just practical, and I've learned that the dead don't want us to die with them. They want us to carry their love forward into whatever comes next. She squeezed his hand. Your Sarah sounds like she was a woman who understood that. She was, John agreed quietly. Then, with visible effort, he straightened his shoulders. Enough dwelling. Work needs doing, storm or no storm. Animals need tending, wood needs bringing in. Then let's do it together, Margaret said. And afterward, I'd like to bake bread if there's enough flour. This cabin needs to smell like something other than grief. That almost smile returned to John's face. There's plenty of flour. Sarah always kept extra, said the smell of baking bread made a house a home. Smart woman, Margaret said, and began clearing the breakfast dishes. The day settled into a rhythm similar to the previous one, but with a different quality to the silence. John went out to tend the animals, alone this time, as the storm was too fierce for Margaret to safely accompany him. While he was gone, Margaret explored the cabin more thoroughly, opening cupboards and drawers with the careful curiosity of someone trying to understand her new home. In the bedroom dresser, she found carefully folded women's clothing, Sarah's things, preserved as though she might return at any moment. Dresses, shawls, undergarments, all clean and neatly stored. Margaret's first instinct was to leave them untouched, to respect the shrine John had created. But then she thought of Sarah's words, passed down through John's memory, about not letting this place become a tomb. When John returned, stamping snow from his boots and unwrapping his scarf, Margaret was waiting in the main room with a question she'd been rehearsing. John, I found Sarah's clothes in the bedroom dresser. I don't want to intrude, but I need space for my own things. Would it be all right if I packed them away? His face went carefully blank. You want to get rid of her things? No, not get rid of, just pack them carefully, with respect. Perhaps in a trunk in the barn. That way they're preserved, but not, she searched for the right words. Not taking up space meant for the living. John stood very still, water from melting snow dripping onto the floor. Margaret held her breath, afraid she'd pushed too far too fast. Then slowly, he nodded. You're right. She'd have been the first to say so. Sarah was never one for dwelling on the past. He removed his coat and hung it on the peg. There's a trunk in the barn, good cedar one. Belonged to her grandmother. We can use that. Together they approached the task with solemn care. Margaret lifted each garment, folding it properly before John placed it in the trunk he'd brought from the barn. A blue calico dress with tiny white flowers. A green wool skirt, worn but carefully mended. A white nightgown with delicate embroidery at the collar. Each piece told a story, painted a picture of a woman who valued practicality but appreciated beauty. At the bottom of the drawer, wrapped in tissue paper, Margaret found a wedding dress. Simple cream muslin with lace at the throat and cuffs. It had yellowed slightly with age but remained beautiful in its simplicity. She made that herself, John said quietly, coming to stand beside Margaret. Took her 3 months. She was so proud of it, wore it like it was silk and jewels. Margaret held the dress up, and a photograph fell from its folds. She caught it before it hit the floor. Another picture of Sarah and John on their wedding day, both looking impossibly young and happy. John wore a suit that was clearly borrowed, too short in the sleeves. Sarah held a bouquet of wild roses. Keep that one out, John said. Put it with the others on the mantel. She deserves to be remembered. She does, Margaret agreed, setting it aside. She carefully folded the wedding dress and placed it in the trunk. She deserves to be honored, not forgotten. But John, honoring the dead doesn't mean we stop living. I know, he said, or I'm starting to know. It's just hard to let go. You're not letting go, you're making room. There's a difference. They finished packing the trunk in silence. John carried it back to the barn while Margaret wiped out the dresser and arranged her own modest belongings inside. It felt strange, occupying space that had belonged to another woman, but also necessary. This was her home now, her life. She couldn't live as a ghost in Sarah's house. When John returned, Margaret was already working on bread dough, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. The flour, water, salt, and yeast came together under her fingers, transforming into something elastic and alive. John watched her work with undisguised fascination. "You're good at that," he observed. "I should be. I've made enough loaves to fill a bakery." Margaret kneaded the dough with firm, rhythmic motions. "My mother taught me when I was 6. She said a woman who could make good bread would never starve." She was right about that. John moved to the table and sat down, apparently content to watch her work. "Sarah tried to teach me, but I never got the hang of it. Hers always rose perfect and golden. Mine came out dense as bricks." "It's all in the kneading," Margaret said. "Too little and it won't rise properly. Too much and it gets tough. You have to feel when it's right." She shaped the dough into a ball and placed it in a greased bowl, covering it with a clean cloth. "Now it rests and rises. Give it a few hours, and we'll have fresh bread for supper." "I look forward to it," John said, and he actually smiled. A real smile this time, not the ghost of one. It transformed his face, making him look years younger. Margaret found herself smiling back, feeling something warm unfold in her chest. As the bread rose, they settled into the day's quiet rhythm. John returned to his veterinary manual, making occasional notes. Margaret found a worn Bible on the shelf, Sarah's, based on the name inscribed inside the cover, and settled into the rocking chair to read. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside a different kind of peace was settling in. Midday came and went. Margaret made sandwiches from yesterday's bread and sliced ham, and they ate without much conversation, companionable in their silence. After lunch, John surprised her by pulling out a checkerboard. "You play?" he asked. "I do, though I'm not very good." "Good! Neither am I. Sarah used to beat me every time." They set up the board on the table, and Margaret quickly discovered that John had undersold his skill. He played with careful strategy, thinking several moves ahead. Still, Margaret managed to hold her own, and when she finally captured his last piece, John actually laughed. A rusty sound, as though his laughter muscles had forgotten their purpose. "You lied," he accused without heat. "You're better than good." "I said I wasn't very good. I never said I didn't win." Margaret reset the board. "Again?" They played 3 more games, trading victories, and with each game, John seemed to relax a little more. By the 4th game, he was making jokes, dry, subtle things that took Margaret a moment to recognize as humor. She found herself laughing, genuine and free, in a way she hadn't laughed in months. When the bread had risen sufficiently, Margaret shaped it into loaves and placed them in the oven. The smell that began to fill the cabin was glorious, yeasty and warm, promising comfort and sustenance. John closed his book and simply sat, breathing in the scent with his eyes closed. "Forgot how good that smells," he murmured. "Thank you, Margaret." "You're welcome, though you may want to wait until you taste it before thanking me." But when the bread emerged golden and perfect, and Margaret sliced into it, revealing a tender, airy crumb, John's expression said everything words couldn't. They ate the fresh bread with butter melting into it, and for several minutes the only sound was contented chewing. "This," John said finally, "is the best bread I've ever tasted, and I'm including Sarah's in that comparison, though don't tell her I said so." Margaret felt absurdly pleased by the compliment. "I won't tell a soul." As evening approached, John grew quiet again, but it was a different quality of quiet, thoughtful rather than withdrawn. He stared into the fire, his brow furrowed, clearly working through something in his mind. Margaret continued her mending, giving him space to think. Finally, he spoke. "Margaret, I need to ask you something." She set down her sewing. "All right. Why did you really come here? Not the surface reasons. I understand about Philadelphia and being alone and all that. But what made you willing to travel across a continent to marry a stranger?" Margaret considered the question, knowing he deserved an honest answer. "Because I was disappearing," she said at last. "In Philadelphia, I was becoming invisible. Every year that passed without a husband, without children, I became less real to the world around me. People stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a failure, I suppose. A cautionary tale about what happens to women who wait too long or aim too high or simply have bad luck. John nodded, his eyes intent on her face. I got tired of being invisible, Margaret continued. I wanted to matter again. And your advertisement, with its honesty and lack of pretense, offered me a chance at that. A chance to build something real, even if it wasn't a love match. To have a purpose beyond sowing other women's dreams. She met his eyes directly. I came here to save my own life, John. Maybe that's selfish, but it's true. It's not selfish, John said firmly. It's honest, and I appreciate honesty. He was quiet for a moment, then added, I should be honest with you too. I didn't place that advertisement looking for a wife. Not really. I was looking for a reason to keep going. After Sarah and Thomas died, this place felt empty. Too big for just me, too full of memories. I thought maybe if someone else was here, it would be easier to remember why I built this place to begin with. And is it? Margaret asked softly. Easier? John considered. Yes. And no. It's hard having you here, seeing someone else in Sarah's kitchen, in Sarah's chair, but it's also good. A good kind of hard. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Margaret assured him. Change is always hard, even necessary change. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling, the storm still raging but somehow less threatening than before. Margaret picked up her mending again, and John returned to his book, but now there was an understanding between them that hadn't existed before. They were two wounded people trying to heal, and maybe, just maybe, they could help each other in that process. Night fell early, as it did in winter, and with it came a new sound, a sharp crack followed by a heavy thud that shook the cabin. John was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. What was that? Margaret asked, setting aside her sewing. Tree branch, probably. Wind strong enough to snap them. He peered out into the darkness, then tensed. No, wait. That's not a branch. Something's wrong with the barn. He was already pulling on his coat before Margaret could respond. She jumped up, grabbing her own wraps. I'm coming with you. Margaret, don't argue. If something's wrong, you might need help. 4 hands are better than 2. John hesitated only a moment, then nodded curtly. Stay behind me. Hold on to my coat. Don't let go for anything. They stepped out into a nightmare. The storm had intensified to a degree Margaret wouldn't have thought possible. The wind didn't howl. It screamed, a living thing determined to tear them apart. Snow came at them horizontally, each flake a tiny knife. Margaret buried her face in John's back and held onto his coat with both hands, trusting him completely. The journey to the barn took an eternity. When they finally reached it, John pulled the door open and they stumbled inside, gasping. The horses were agitated, stamping and snorting. Clover lowed nervously from her stall, and above them a section of the barn roof had caved in, crushed under the weight of snow and ice. Damn, John breathed. He looked up at the damaged roof, snow already beginning to filter through the gap. This is bad. If the whole roof goes, the animals will freeze. What do we do? Margaret asked. Need to brace it from inside, keep the weight distributed until the storm passes and I can fix it properly. John was already moving, assessing the damage with a practiced eye. There's lumber stacked in the back corner. We'll need to create supports under the weak points. They worked together in the dim light of John's lantern, Margaret holding boards while John hammered them into place. Her arms ached from the effort. Her hands grew numb despite her gloves, but she didn't complain. The animals' lives depended on them getting this right. An hour passed, maybe more. John created a framework of supports, carefully distributing the weight. When he finally stepped back, examining his work, he nodded with grim satisfaction. That'll hold. Not pretty, but it'll hold until I can do proper repairs. They returned to the cabin through the storm, both exhausted and frozen. Margaret's teeth chattered so hard she bit her tongue, tasting blood. John looked little better, his face gray with cold and fatigue. Inside, he built up both fires while Margaret heated water for tea. They sat before the fireplace, wrapped in blankets, waiting for warmth to seep back into their bones. John's hand shook as he held his cup, and Margaret noticed that the bandages had come off in their work, the cracks in his skin reopened and bleeding again. Let me see, she said, setting down her own cup. I'm fine. John Rowan, let me see your hands. He did, perhaps too tired to argue. Margaret tended them again, cleaning away the blood and dirt, applying fresh salve, wrapping them in clean bandages. His skin was ice cold, and she found herself chafing his hands between hers, trying to restore circulation. You're good at this, John said quietly. Taking care of people. It's a gift. It's necessity that made it look like a gift, Margaret replied, but she was pleased nonetheless. My parents needed care. I learned. Still, not everyone would have come out into that storm with me. You could have stayed safe by the fire. And let you risk yourself alone? That wouldn't have been right. She finished bandaging and sat back. We're partners, remember? Partners share the risks. Something shifted in John's expression, a softening, an opening. Yeah, he said. Partners. They sat in comfortable silence until the shivers finally stopped. Then Margaret made a late supper, soup from dried beans and vegetables, more of the fresh bread. They ate slowly, both still recovering from the cold and exertion. As they cleaned up after the meal, John spoke again. Tomorrow, if the storm breaks enough, I'll need to check that roof more thoroughly. Might need to do temporary repairs even in the snow. I'll help, Margaret said immediately. It's dangerous work. John, she turned to face him directly. I'm not fragile. I won't break. Let me help. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but you follow my instructions exactly. Roofs are tricky, especially in winter. I will, Margaret promised. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the storm and John's movements in the loft above, Margaret realized something had changed. The cabin no longer felt like Sarah's house where she was an intruder. It was becoming something else. A shared space. A home being built by two people learning to trust each other. The third day dawned with the storm still raging, but with slightly less fury. The wind had dropped from a shriek to a roar, and the snow, while still heavy, no longer came in blinding sheets. John stood at the window, assessing conditions with the eye of someone who'd survived many Montana winters. It's easing, he said when Margaret joined him. Another day, maybe two, and it'll blow itself out. Will the barn hold until then? Should, but I'd feel better checking those supports in daylight. He glanced at her. You still want to help? I do. They made the trip to the barn mid-morning, and Margaret was relieved to see that John's emergency repairs had held. The supports stood firm, bearing the weight of snow and ice, pressing down on the damaged roof. Together, they added additional bracing, working efficiently as a team. Margaret found she liked the work, the physical exertion, the clear problem with a clear solution, the satisfaction of seeing immediate results. In Philadelphia, her work had been delicate and precise, but ultimately decorative. This was different. This was survival, and there was an honesty to it she found deeply satisfying. When they returned to the cabin, both flushed with exertion despite the cold, John made an observation. You're stronger than you look. Margaret laughed. Is that a compliment? Yes. He smiled that rare, transforming smile. Definitely a compliment. Most city women would have swooned at the first sign of real work. Then it's fortunate I'm not most city women, Margaret replied, echoing her words from the first night. She hung up her coat and moved to the kitchen. How do you feel about stew for supper? I noticed you have plenty of venison. Love it. Sarah used to make a stew with dried cherries and... He stopped, then consciously continued, I could write down the recipe if you want to try it. It was the first time he'd mentioned Sarah without pain shadowing his face. Margaret felt something warm bloom in her chest. I'd like that very much. They spent the afternoon in domestic harmony. John wrote out the recipe in his careful, precise hand while Margaret prepared the ingredients. He added notes. Don't skimp on the pepper and let it simmer at least 2 hours. And personal observations that made the recipe come alive. It was, Margaret realized, a gift. He was sharing his wife's legacy, inviting Margaret to become part of the cabin's history rather than trying to replace what had been lost. The stew turned out beautifully, rich and savory, with just a hint of sweetness from the cherries. They ate together at the table and John pronounced it nearly as good as Sarah's. which Margaret took as high praise indeed. After supper, as they cleaned up, John spoke hesitantly. "There's something I should probably show you, up in the loft, if you're willing." Curious, Margaret followed him up the ladder. The loft was small but efficiently arranged, a bed, a chest, a few pegs for clothes. But what caught her attention was the far corner, where a rocking horse stood beside a small wooden bed, both draped with sheets to protect them from dust. "Thomas's things," John said quietly. I haven't been able to pack them away yet. Every time I try, He trailed off, his throat working. Margaret approached the covered furniture slowly, reverently. "May I?" At John's nod, she lifted the sheet from the rocking horse. It was beautifully made, painted gray with a black mane and tail, clearly crafted with love and care. The small bed beside it was equally fine, with carved posts and a mattress still covered in tiny quilts. "Did you make these?" Margaret asked. "The bed and horse, yes. Sarah made the quilt." John's voice was rough. "Started on them the day she found out she was expecting. Had the whole set finished before Thomas was born." Margaret ran her hand over the rocking horse's carved mane. "They're beautiful, John. True works of art." Thomas loved that horse. Rode it every day, gave it different names depending on his mood. Called it Thunder when he was feeling brave, Snowflake when it was winter, Star when the mood struck him. John moved to stand beside her, his hand joining hers on the horse's back. He was going to be 5 in March. Sarah was planning a party, had it all figured out. And then the fever came, Margaret finished softly. She turned to face John. "What do you want to do with these things? Really want? In your heart?" He was quiet for a long time, staring at the rocking horse as memories played across his face. Finally, he spoke. "I want to keep them. Not hidden away in a trunk, but here, where I can see them, where I can remember what we built together. But I also want," he struggled with the words, "I want to stop feeling like keeping them means I'm waiting for him to come back. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Margaret assured him. "These things honor Thomas's memory. They don't need to be hidden to be respected. Maybe we could move them to a corner of the main room, display them properly the way you display Sarah's photograph?" John considered this, then slowly nodded. Yeah, I think that would be good. Sarah would have liked that, keeping his things where we could appreciate them instead of sealed away in the dark." Together they carried the rocking horse and small bed down from the loft. John cleared a space near the window, and they arranged the furniture carefully, removing the dust sheets and revealing the full beauty of his craftsmanship. Margaret folded the tiny quilts and laid them on the bed, their colors bright against the wood. When they stepped back to survey their work, John's eyes were wet, but his expression was peaceful. "Thank you," he said, "for understanding, for not trying to erase them." "John, I would never try to erase your family. They made you who you are. They're part of this place's story, and I'm honored to help preserve that." Margaret touched his arm lightly. "You loved deeply, and you lost deeply. That's nothing to hide or be ashamed of." He covered her hand with his own, that simple gesture of connection becoming more natural each time. "You're a remarkable woman, Margaret Vale." "Not yet, Rowan?" she asked gently. John's thumb moved slowly over her knuckles, an unconscious caress. "Do you want to be? Truly? Not because you traveled all this way or because the advertisement said so, but because you want to?" Margaret considered the question carefully. 3 days ago, she'd stepped off a train to meet a silent stranger. Now, standing in this cabin with the storm still raging outside, looking at a man who was slowly opening his heart after years of grief, she realized something surprising. "Yes," she said simply, "I want to be Margaret Rowan. I want to build a life here with you, whatever that life looks like. I want to be your partner in truth, not just necessity." John's hand tightened around hers. "Then when this storm breaks and we can get to town, we'll see the Reverend. Make it official." He paused, then added with unusual vulnerability, "I can't promise to be easy to live with. I've gotten used to silence and solitude. I'll probably frustrate you more often than not." "And I'll probably frustrate you right back," Margaret countered. "I have opinions about things, and I'm not always good at keeping them to myself. I rearrange things to suit myself, and I hum when I work, and I sometimes talk to myself when I'm thinking through problems." "I like your humming," John said. "And your rearranging has already made this place feel more like a home than it has in 2 years. As for talking to yourself, at least that means someone in this cabin knows how to carry on a conversation." Margaret laughed, surprising herself. "Are you making a joke about your own silence?" "Seemed like it was time," John replied, and there was actual humor in his eyes. "Besides, you've been talking enough for both of us. Figured I should at least acknowledge it." They stood there in the lamplight, hands joined, the rocking horse and small bed bearing silent witness to the past, while two people tentatively reached toward a future. Outside, the storm began its slow diminishment, and inside, something new and fragile was being born. Not a replacement for what had been lost, but something wholly its own. The fourth morning brought a miracle: silence. Margaret woke to the absence of wind, the lack of battering snow against the windows, and for a moment she lay perfectly still, almost afraid to breathe lest the storm hear her and return with renewed vengeance. But the quiet held, profound and complete, broken only by the soft crackle of fire in the stove and John's footsteps in the main room. She dressed quickly and emerged to find him standing at the window, coffee cup in hand, staring out at a world transformed. Sunlight, actual, brilliant sunlight, streamed through the glass, turning the snow-covered landscape into a field of diamonds. The sky stretched blue and infinite overhead, so clear it hurt to look at. "It's over," John said without turning. Storm broke sometime in the night. Margaret came to stand beside him, and the sight took her breath away. Snow lay everywhere in massive drifts, sculpted by the wind into fantastic shapes. The path to the barn had disappeared entirely, buried under at least 4 feet of white. The fence posts were barely visible, transformed into snow-capped sentinels. Everything was clean, pure, untouched, a blank page waiting to be written on. "It's beautiful," Margaret breathed. "It's deadly," John corrected, but there was no harshness in his tone. "All that beauty will kill you if you're not careful. The cold, the drifts, plenty of folks have died in weather like this, even after the storm passes." He finally turned to look at her, and his expression was serious. "Which is why we need to be smart about digging out. It'll take days to clear paths properly." "Then we'd better get started," Margaret said practically. "After breakfast, of course. No sense working on an empty stomach." They ate quickly, oatmeal again, with dried apples stirred in and a generous drizzle of honey. John was preoccupied, clearly running through mental lists of what needed doing and in what order. Margaret let him think, understanding that he was shifting from storm survival mode into recovery mode, a different set of challenges requiring different solutions. "We'll start with the path to the barn," John said as they cleaned up the breakfast dishes. "Animals need tending first, always. Then I should check the roof repairs in daylight, make sure everything held. After that, we'll need to dig out around the cabin, make sure the doors can open properly, clear the windows. The path to the woodshed is next priority. Then—" "John," Margaret interrupted gently, "we have time. The storm is over. We don't need to do everything at once." He blinked, then smiled ruefully. Force of habit. When you work a ranch alone, you learn to prioritize and move fast. Hard to shut that off. "Well, you're not alone anymore," Margaret reminded him. "So let's tackle this together, one task at a time." They bundled up in their warmest clothes and stepped outside into a world reborn. The cold hit immediately, sharp and clean, but without the wind it was bearable. Almost pleasant, Margaret thought, if you didn't have hours of backbreaking work ahead of you. John retrieved 2 snow shovels from the small shed attached to the cabin, one for him, one for Margaret. He demonstrated the proper technique, showing her how to lift with her legs instead of her back, how to pace herself to avoid exhaustion, how to read the snow to find the most efficient path through the drifts. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," Margaret confirmed. They started digging. Within minutes, Margaret understood why John had emphasized pacing. The snow was heavy, waterlogged from its own weight, and each shovelful felt like lifting stone. Her shoulders began to ache, then her back, then her arms. Sweat dampened her dress beneath the heavy coat despite the freezing temperature. She wanted to stop, to rest, but John kept working with methodical efficiency, and pride wouldn't let her quit before he did. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, John called a halt. "Break," he said, leaning on his shovel. Push too hard and you'll hurt yourself. Margaret gratefully stopped, gasping for breath. They'd cleared perhaps 20 feet of path, leaving walls of snow on either side taller than Margaret's head. The barn still looked impossibly far away. How long will this take? She asked. Rest of the day, probably, maybe into tomorrow. John pulled out a canteen and took a long drink, then handed it to Margaret. Used to take me and Sarah 2 full days to dig out after a big storm, with Thomas helping, well, mostly playing in the snow piles, but still, it's slow work. They resumed digging, settling into a rhythm. Scoop, lift, throw, scoop, lift, throw. Margaret's mind began to wander, thinking about Philadelphia and how different her life would have been if she'd stayed. She'd be in Mrs. Henderson's shop right now, bent over some society woman's wedding gown, her fingers cramped from tiny stitches, breathing in fabric dust and listening to Mrs. Henderson criticize her work. Invisible. Unnecessary. Slowly fading into nothing. Here, she was necessary. Every shovelful of snow she moved mattered. Every bit of help she provided to John made a difference. Her muscles might ache and her hands might blister, but she was real, solid, present in a way she hadn't been in years. What are you smiling about? John asked. Margaret hadn't realized she was smiling. Just thinking about how much I prefer this to sewing wedding dresses. John's laugh was surprised and genuine. Most women would think you'd lost your mind, preferring snow shoveling to indoor work. Most women haven't spent 6 years making dreams for other people while their own dreams died, Margaret replied. She drove her shovel into the snow with particular vigor. This is hard work, but it's honest. And it's mine. Ours, John corrected softly. Ours, Margaret agreed, and the word settled warm in her chest. By noon, they'd reached the barn. Both were exhausted, faces red with cold and exertion, but there was satisfaction in looking back at the cleared path stretching behind them. John opened the barn door and they stepped into the familiar warmth of animal breath and hay. The horses nickered a greeting, clearly pleased to see them. Clover lowed plaintively, her udder swollen with milk. John immediately set about his chores, feeding the horses, breaking ice in the water trough, checking each animal thoroughly for signs of cold injury. Margaret approached Duchess, the gentler of the 2 horses, and stroked her velvet nose. The mare leaned into the touch, clearly starved for attention after days of isolation during the storm. She likes you, John observed, watching them with interest. Duchess doesn't warm to everyone that quickly. We understand each other, Margaret said, continuing to stroke the horse's neck. We're both trying to find our place in a new world. John moved to stand beside her, his hand joining hers on Duchess's neck. You've found your place, Margaret. You're exactly where you're meant to be. She turned to look at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. His face was serious, his blue eyes steady on hers. In that moment, Margaret felt something shift inside her. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of love. The foundation upon which love might be built, given time and care. Thank you, she said quietly, for taking a chance on me. Pretty sure you're the one who took the chance, John replied. Traveling across the country to marry a man you'd never met, who barely knew how to write a proper letter. That takes more courage than anything I've done. Or more desperation, Margaret countered with a wry smile. Courage and desperation often look the same from the outside. John's hand covered hers completely, warm and rough and solid. Either way, I'm grateful you came. They stood like that for a long moment, the horse's quiet breathing and Clover's contented chewing the only sounds. Then John cleared his throat and stepped back, returning to his work with an efficiency that suggested he was slightly embarrassed by the moment of vulnerability. Margaret helped as best she could, learning the routines of barn work, which buckets held, which feed, how much hay each animal needed, the proper way to milk Clover without getting kicked. John was patient, explaining things clearly without condescension, correcting her mistakes gently. By the time they finished, Margaret felt she could handle the morning chores herself if needed. The roof held, John announced after climbing up to inspect the damaged section. Repairs are solid. I'll need to do permanent work come spring, but for now we're safe. That's a relief, Margaret said. I was worried it might have weakened during the night. So was I, John admitted. But between the bracing and the weight distribution, it's stable enough. He climbed down, brushing snow from his coat. Ready to head back? We should eat something before tackling the next section. The return trip through the cleared path was easier, though Margaret's legs trembled with exhaustion by the time they reached the cabin. John noticed her stumble and caught her elbow, steadying her with careful strength. "You pushed too hard," he said, concern evident in his voice. "I'm fine," Margaret insisted, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Just need food and a moment to rest." John guided her to the rocking chair by the fire, then set about preparing lunch with surprising efficiency. He heated leftover stew, sliced bread, and even made fresh tea the way Margaret preferred it. When he handed her a steaming bowl and cup, she looked up at him with gratitude. "You don't have to serve me," she protested weakly. "You've been shoveling snow for hours without complaint. Least I can do is heat up some stew." He settled into his chair with his own bowl. "Besides, Sarah taught me that marriage is about taking care of each other. Some days you do more, some days I do. It evens out in the end." They ate in comfortable silence, and Margaret felt strength gradually returning to her limbs. The food was warm and filling, the fire pleasant against her cold, flushed face. She studied John as he ate, noting the way his hair fell across his forehead when he bent over his bowl, the small scar above his left eyebrow she hadn't noticed before, the careful way he chewed his food as though he'd learned long ago not to waste a single bite. "Tell me about your parents," John said suddenly. "You've mentioned them, but I don't know much about them." Margaret set down her spoon, surprised by the question, but pleased he'd asked. "My father was a farrier, as I mentioned. Thomas Vale from County Cork originally, though he came to America as a boy. He was quiet, like you, more comfortable with horses than people, but he was kind, and he loved my mother fiercely." "And your mother?" "Catherine O'Brien before she married. Irish through and through, with opinions on everything and the stubbornness to back them up." Margaret smiled at the memory. "She ran the household with an iron fist wrapped in lace. Nothing happened in our home without her knowledge and approval. But she was also warm, generous to a fault. If someone needed help, she was the first to show up with a pot of soup or an offer to mend clothes or mind children." "You're like her," John observed. "The warmth and generosity part, anyway. Can't speak to the stubbornness yet." "Oh, I have that too," Margaret assured him. "Just wait until we disagree about something important. You'll see the Irish side come out quickly enough." John's lips quirked in that almost smile. "I'll keep that in mind. What happened to them?" "Father first, kicked by a horse he was shoeing, fractured his skull. He lingered for 3 days, then slipped away. Mother was never the same after. She tried to carry on, but her heart was broken. The following winter she caught pneumonia and didn't fight very hard to recover. I think she was ready to join him." Margaret's voice caught slightly. "I was 23, suddenly alone in a city that had no use for an orphaned Irish girl with no dowry and no prospects." John reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. "I'm sorry. Losing both parents so close together, that's hard." "It was," Margaret admitted. "Still is, sometimes. I catch myself wanting to tell Mother about something or ask Father's advice and then remembering they're gone." She squeezed his hand. "But I think they'd be happy with my choice to come here. They wanted me settled, happy, building a life." "I hope I can help you build that life," John said quietly. "I know I'm not much, just a quiet rancher with more ghosts than conversation. But I'll try to be what you need." "You're already more than I expected," Margaret told him honestly. "You're kind and honest, and you've shown me more respect in 4 days than most men in Philadelphia showed me in 6 years. That's enough, John. More than enough." They finished their lunch hand in hand, and when they rose to return to the snow clearing, John didn't let go immediately. Instead, he pulled Margaret gently to her feet and stood there, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Just thinking," John said, "about how life surprises you sometimes. How the worst storm I've seen in years brought me something I didn't know I needed." "A stubborn Irish woman who doesn't know when to quit?" Margaret teased, trying to lighten the suddenly intense moment. "A partner," John corrected. "Someone to share the load with. Someone to make this place feel alive again." He released her hand slowly, as though reluctant to break contact. "Come on. We've got more digging to do." They spent the afternoon clearing the area around the cabin, creating paths to the woodshed and the small structure that served as a root cellar. The work was just as hard as the morning's labor, maybe harder since their muscles were already tired, but they pushed through together. John was vigilant about breaks, forcing Margaret to stop and rest even when she wanted to keep going, mindful of her city-soft hands developing blisters despite her gloves. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold, they finally stopped for the day. The cabin stood in the center of cleared paths like a ship in frozen seas, accessible and functional once more. It wasn't everything that needed doing. The storm had created weeks of work, but it was enough for now. Inside, they collapsed in their respective chairs, too tired to even think about supper immediately. Margaret pulled off her gloves and examined her hands, red, raw, with several blisters beginning to form despite John's caution. She flexed her fingers experimentally and winced. "Let me see," John said, reaching for her hands. "They're fine, Margaret." His tone was gentle but firm. "Let me see." She surrendered her hands, and he examined them with the same careful attention she'd given his damaged hands days earlier. He fetched the salve and bandages without being asked, tending her blisters with surprising gentleness for such large hands. "You worked too hard today," he said as he wrapped the bandages. "Should have stopped you sooner." "You couldn't have stopped me if you'd tried," Margaret replied. "I'm not made of porcelain, John. I won't break from a little hard work." "Still, these will hurt for days." He finished the bandaging and sat back. "Tomorrow we rest. The rest of the digging can wait." "But the can wait," John repeated firmly. "You pushed yourself past sensible limits today, and while I admire the spirit, I won't have you injuring yourself permanently. Tomorrow we rest. Let your hands heal. Agreed?" Margaret wanted to argue, but the throbbing in her palms suggested he might be right. "Agreed, but only if you promise to let me help with the barn chores." "Deal." John stood and moved to the kitchen. "Now sit still and let me handle supper. You've earned a rest." He prepared a simple meal, fried potatoes with onions, eggs from the barn, thick slices of bread toasted on the stovetop. Margaret watched him work, appreciating the economical grace of his movements, the way he seemed to always know exactly where everything was despite the kitchen's small size. He moved like someone who'd been doing this for years, which, of course, he had. When he set the plate before her, Margaret was surprised to find herself ravenous. The day's work had burned through her energy stores, and she ate with an enthusiasm that would have scandalized the Philadelphia ladies who'd always insisted women should eat like birds. "Good appetite," John observed with approval. "Sarah used to say ranch work would make anyone eat like a field hand, and she was right." "Your Sarah was a wise woman," Margaret said between bites. "She was." John's expression was thoughtful rather than pained. "I think she'd like you. She always said this place needed someone with grit and determination, someone who wouldn't wilt at the first sign of difficulty. You've got both in abundance." "I hope I would have liked her too," Margaret said carefully, unsure how to navigate this conversation about the woman whose place she was slowly filling. John was quiet for a moment, then spoke with unusual openness. "You know what's strange? For the first time since they died, I can think about Sarah and Thomas without feeling like I'm drowning. It still hurts, probably always will, but it's not the same crushing weight it used to be." He met Margaret's eyes. "That's because of you. Your presence here, the way you've honored their memory while still making this place your own. You've helped me start to heal, Margaret. I want you to know that." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm glad. That's all I wanted, to help, to matter, to build something real. I never wanted to erase them or pretend they didn't exist." "I know. That's what makes you special." John reached across the table and covered her bandaged hand with his. "You've got a generous heart, Margaret Vale. I'm lucky you answered my advertisement." They finished supper in companionable silence, and afterward John insisted on washing the dishes while Margaret sat by the fire. Her whole body ached in ways she'd never experienced. Muscles she hadn't known she possessed announced their existence through throbbing complaints. But beneath the physical discomfort was a deep satisfaction. She'd worked hard, accomplished something real, proven her worth. As darkness fell completely, John lit the lamps and settled into his chair with his veterinary manual. Margaret picked up her mending, but her bandaged hands made the delicate work difficult. After several frustrating attempts to thread a needle, she set it aside with a sigh. Problem? John asked, looking up from his book. Just frustrated. I'm used to being able to do things with my hands, and these bandages make everything clumsy. Then don't do anything that requires fine motor control, John suggested reasonably. Read a book, rest, let yourself heal. Margaret looked around the cabin and realized she hadn't really explored John's small library. She moved to the shelf beside the fireplace and examined the titles. There were the veterinary manuals John studied religiously, several agricultural texts about crop rotation and animal husbandry, a few novels that looked well read, and surprisingly, several volumes of poetry. You like poetry, Margaret said, pulling down a collection of Wordsworth. Sarah did, John replied. Used to read it aloud in the evenings. I didn't understand half of it, but I liked listening to her voice, the way she'd get excited about particular phrases or images. He paused. Haven't read any since she died. Couldn't bear it. Margaret returned to her chair with the book, turning pages carefully with her bandaged fingers. Would it bother you if I read some? Aloud, I mean? John's expression flickered with something, pain maybe, or longing. Then he nodded slowly. No, I think I'd like that. Margaret opened to a random page and began to read. The words flowed over them, verses about nature and beauty, about loss and redemption, about the quiet strength found in simple things. Her voice was nothing like Sarah's must have been, and she stumbled occasionally over unfamiliar phrases, but John listened with his eyes closed, his face gradually relaxing. When she finished the poem, he opened his eyes. Thank you. Thank you. Would you like me to read more? Please. She read for the next hour, moving through Wordsworth into some Byron, then finding a collection of American poets she didn't recognize. John remained in his chair, perfectly still, listening with an intensity that suggested he was hearing more than just the words, perhaps hearing echoes of evenings past, of his wife's voice mixing with Margaret's, of a home that had once been filled with such moments. Finally, when Margaret's voice began to grow hoarse, John stirred. That's enough for tonight. You'll hurt your throat. Margaret closed the book and returned it to the shelf. When she turned back, John was standing, and there was something different in his expression, a softness, an openness she hadn't seen before. Margaret, he said, and then seemed to struggle with what to say next. Finally, he managed, I think Sarah would have been glad that you're here, that you're helping me learn to live again. She wouldn't have wanted me to be alone forever. I think she must have loved you very much, Margaret said softly, to want your happiness even beyond her own life. She did, and I loved her. John took a step closer. I want to be honest with you about something. I don't know if I can love like that again. That kind of love, the kind Sarah and I had, I don't know if a person gets that twice in one lifetime. Margaret felt a pang in her chest but nodded. I understand. And I'm not asking for that, John. I'm asking for partnership, respect, companionship. If love comes, then that's a gift. If it doesn't, then we'll build something else, something just as valuable. You deserve more than just partnership, John said, his voice rough. You deserve someone who can give you everything. I deserve someone honest and kind who sees me as a person rather than an inconvenience or a burden, Margaret corrected. Someone who treats me as an equal partner, someone who makes me feel real again. And that's exactly what you've given me in just 4 days, John. That's worth more than pretty words about love that might not mean anything. John looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his eyes. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered for just a moment against her cheek, rough and warm. You're remarkable, he said quietly. Truly remarkable. Margaret's heart beat faster at the gentleness of the touch. So are you. You just don't see it yet. They stood there in the lamplight, close enough that Margaret could see the flecks of gray in John's blue eyes, the fine lines around his mouth, the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. She thought he might kiss her, hoped he might even, but instead he stepped back, clearing his throat. You should sleep. Tomorrow we rest, but the day after we'll need to start planning for town. Storm will have hit there too, and folks will need checking on. Plus, we've got a preacher to visit. His smile was small but real. Can't have you living here unmarried much longer. Wouldn't be proper. Heaven forbid we be improper, Margaret teased gently. Good night, John. Night, Margaret. She retreated to the bedroom, her heart still beating faster than normal, her cheeks still warm where his fingers had touched. She changed into her nightgown and climbed into bed, but sleep was slow to come. Her mind replayed the day, the backbreaking work, the growing ease between them, the moment by the fire when he touched her face with such unexpected tenderness. She was falling for him, Margaret realized, not in the desperate, consuming way of storybook romance, but in something slower, deeper, more real. She was falling for his quiet strength, his careful kindness, his willingness to honor the past while reaching toward the future. She was falling for the way he made her feel necessary, important, seen, and maybe, just maybe, he was starting to fall for her too. In the loft above, John lay awake staring at the ceiling. His hand still tingled slightly from where he'd touched Margaret's face, and he couldn't quite believe he'd done it. For 2 years he'd avoided physical contact beyond what was necessary, afraid that any tenderness might shatter the fragile control he'd maintained over his grief. But tonight, standing close to Margaret, listening to her read poetry in the lamplight, he'd felt something wake up inside him, something he'd thought dead and buried with Sarah. It wasn't the same feeling he'd had with Sarah. That had been young love, passionate and all-consuming, the kind of love that burned bright and fierce. This was different, quieter, steadier, like the difference between a wildfire and a hearth fire. Both were valuable, both provided warmth, but one consumed everything in its path while the other sustained and comforted. He could build a life with Margaret. He was already building one, day by day, conversation by conversation, shared task by shared task. She fit here in ways he hadn't anticipated, made the cabin feel like a home rather than a mausoleum. And more than that, she made him want to try again, to risk caring, to open himself to the possibility of happiness. It terrified him. But for the first time in 2 years, John Rowan felt something other than grief. He felt hope. Morning arrived with a softer quality than previous days, sunlight streaming through the windows in golden shafts that turned the frost patterns on the glass into intricate lacework. Margaret woke slowly, luxuriously, her body grateful for the promised day of rest. Her hands still ached from yesterday's work, but the pain had dulled to a manageable throb beneath John's careful bandaging. She emerged from the bedroom to find John already up, standing at the stove with his back to her. The smell of coffee filled the cabin, mixed with something sweet and yeasty that made her stomach growl despite herself. "What are you making?" she asked, moving closer. John turned, and she was struck again by how different he looked when he smiled, younger, lighter, almost boyish despite the gray threading his hair. "Flapjacks, Sarah's recipe. Figured if we're resting today, we might as well start it right." Margaret came to stand beside him, watching as he poured batter onto the hot griddle with practiced ease. The flapjacks bubbled and browned, and when he flipped them, they revealed perfect golden surfaces. "You're full of surprises," Margaret said. "A rancher who can cook." "Had to learn after Sarah died. It was either that or starve." He slid 3 flapjacks onto a plate and handed it to her, then poured more batter for himself. "Besides, Sarah taught me. She said a man should know how to feed himself, that depending on others for every meal was a form of helplessness she wouldn't tolerate in her husband." "I like her more every time you mention her," Margaret said, carrying her plate to the table. John had already set out butter and a precious jar of maple syrup, luxuries that suggested he'd been saving them for a special occasion. They ate together in comfortable silence, the flapjacks light and perfectly sweetened, the syrup adding richness that made each bite feel like celebration. Margaret found herself studying John between bites, noting the relaxed set of his shoulders, the absence of that haunted look that had shadowed his eyes when she first arrived. He caught her looking and raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Just thinking how different you seem from the man who met me at the train station," Margaret said honestly. "Less like a mountain and more like a person." John considered this, chewing slowly. "I feel different. Lighter, somehow. Like I've been carrying something heavy for so long I forgot what it felt like to set it down, and you've helped me remember." "We helped each other," Margaret corrected. I was drowning in my own way back in Philadelphia. This place, this life, it's given me air to breathe again." After breakfast, true to his word, John declared the day one of rest. He handled the barn chores alone, refusing Margaret's offer of help, and returned with fresh milk and a report that all the animals were thriving despite the storm. The rest of the morning passed in quiet domesticity, John mending tack by the fire, while Margaret, her hands still too tender for fine sewing, sorted through the pantry and made lists of supplies they'd need when they could finally get to town. Around midday, John set aside his work and looked at Margaret with an expression that was part determination, part nervousness. "There's something I want to show you. Outside, you'll need your warm coat." Intrigued, Margaret bundled up and followed him out into the brilliant afternoon. The sun on the snow was almost blinding, and she had to squint against the glare. John led her around the back of the cabin to an area she hadn't explored yet, where the land sloped gently down toward a frozen creek. There, sheltered by a stand of evergreens, stood two simple wooden crosses. The snow around them had been carefully cleared, forming a small protected space. Someone, John obviously, had been out here recently, tending this place even in the midst of the storm's aftermath. Margaret's breath caught. She didn't need to ask who rested here. The crosses were beautifully made, carved with care and obvious love. The larger read Sarah Elizabeth Rowan, beloved wife and mother, 1855 to 1882. The smaller, heartbreakingly small, read Thomas Jonathan Rowan, our precious son, 1877 to 1882. "I wanted you to meet them," John said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Properly, I mean. Not just through photographs and stories, but here, where they rest." Margaret moved forward slowly, reverently, until she stood before the graves. The evergreens sheltered this spot from the worst of the wind, and in summer it would likely be beautiful, peaceful. She could imagine Sarah choosing it, could picture her saying something about wanting to rest somewhere with a view of the mountains and the sound of water nearby. "Hello, Sarah," Margaret said softly, feeling slightly foolish but compelled to speak anyway. "I hope you don't mind me being here. I promise to take good care of your home and of John. I promise to honor what you built together." She turned to the smaller grave, and her voice caught. "And hello, Thomas. Your papa speaks of you with such love. I hope you're at peace, little one, wherever you are." John stood beside her, his hand finding hers and gripping tight. "I come here most days," he said. "Tell them about the ranch, about the weather, about whatever's on my mind. Haven't been able to come since before the storm, though. Felt wrong somehow introducing you through conversation before bringing you here in person." "Thank you," Margaret said, squeezing his hand, "for including me in this, for not shutting me out of the most important parts of your life." They stood there for several minutes, the only sounds the whisper of wind through the evergreens and the distant call of a crow. Margaret felt the weight of the moment, the significance of John sharing this place with her. It was a kind of trust, she realized, deeper than words could express. He was letting her into his grief, his loss, his most carefully guarded spaces. Finally, John spoke again. "I want to tell them about you, about us. Would that be all right?" "Of course," Margaret said. John cleared his throat, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Sarah Thomas, there's someone I want you to know. Her name is Margaret Vale, and she came all the way from Philadelphia to answer my advertisement. I didn't expect much when I placed it. Thought maybe some practical woman would show up who needed a roof over her head and wouldn't ask too much of me. But Margaret," his voice softened, "she's more than I hoped for. Strong and kind and patient with a fool, of a man who forgot how to talk to people. She's making the cabin feel like home again, helping me remember what it means to live instead of just exist." Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks, warm against her cold skin. "I know I can't love her the way I loved you, Sarah," John continued, his voice breaking slightly. "That kind of love was ours alone, and nothing will ever replace it. But I think I'm starting to care for her in a different way, a way that feels right for where I am now. I think you'd like her. I think you'd approve." He paused, then added more firmly, "I know you'd want me to be happy, and Margaret makes me think happiness might be possible again." He turned to the smaller grave. "And Thomas, I wish you could have met her. She's got a good heart and kind hands, and she would have been patient with all your questions and energy. She would have taught you things, made you laugh. I think you would have loved her too. Margaret couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. Instead, she released John's hand long enough to kneel in the snow before the graves, her own words finally coming. I promise to honor your memory, both of you. I promise to help John heal without trying to erase you. You'll always be part of this family, always be loved and remembered. And I promise to be worthy of the trust you're placing in me, Sarah, by leaving behind the man you loved. I'll do my best by him. I swear it. When she stood, brushing snow from her knees, John pulled her into a tight embrace. They held each other there beside the graves, and Margaret felt something shift and settle between them, an understanding and acceptance, a foundation being laid for whatever came next. Thank you, John whispered against her hair. Thank you for understanding. Always, Margaret promised. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, and when they stepped inside, the space felt different somehow, more settled, as though even the walls had been waiting for this moment of acknowledgement and inclusion. John built up the fire while Margaret made tea, and they settled into their chairs with a companionship that felt earned rather than forced. Tell me about the town, Margaret said after a while. Copper Falls. What should I expect when we go? John wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, considering. It's small, maybe 200 people on a good day, less in winter. Reverend Parker runs the church. He's a good man, fair-minded, doesn't judge. General store is owned by the Hansons, Swedish couple, salt of the earth. There's a saloon run by a woman named Pearl, and before you ask, it's a respectable establishment as far as saloons go. Dr. Miller handles the medical needs, though he's getting on in years and talks about finding someone to take over his practice. School teacher is Miss Emily Patterson, young thing from Boston, who came west for adventure and got more than she bargained for. And the people? What will they think of me? John's expression grew serious. They'll be curious. Probably already know about you. News travels fast in small towns, and the train conductor would have mentioned a woman getting off to meet me. Some will be kind, welcoming. Others will judge, compare you to Sarah, whisper about whether it's too soon for me to remarry. He met her eyes directly. I won't lie and say it'll be easy. Small towns can be hard on outsiders, especially women, but I'll be beside you, and anyone who wants to make trouble will have to go through me first. The fierce protectiveness in his voice warmed Margaret more than the fire. I'm not afraid of gossip. I survived 6 years of it in Philadelphia. I can handle Montana. I believe you can, John said, and his smile was proud. Still, I want you prepared. Mrs. Hanson will probably interrogate you about your intentions while pretending to make small talk. Pearl will be more direct. She'll ask straight out why you're here and whether you're after John's land or his heart. Reverend Parker will want to counsel us about the sanctity of marriage. It'll be exhausting. But necessary, Margaret finished. We need supplies, and we need to get married properly. I can endure some uncomfortable conversations for that. The wedding itself will be simple, John continued. No time for anything fancy, and honestly, I'd prefer it that way. Quick ceremony in the church, maybe witnesses if we can find willing ones, then back here before dark. Unless you wanted something more. Margaret shook her head. Simple sounds perfect. I'm not marrying you for show, John. I'm marrying you to build a life. The ceremony is just a formality to make it legal and proper. Good. John seemed relieved. I was worried you might have expectations I couldn't meet. City women sometimes have ideas about weddings. This city woman has sewn enough elaborate wedding gowns to know they're more about display than substance, Margaret said dryly. I'll wear my best dress, say the words that matter, and come home to start our real life. That's all I need. They spent the afternoon in quiet companionship, John reading while Margaret attempted some light mending that didn't tax her healing hands too badly. Around 4, John stood and stretched, his joints popping audibly. Should check on the animals one more time before dark, he said. And I was thinking, tomorrow, if you're up for it, we could hitch up the wagon and head to town. Trails should be passable by now, at least the main road. Get the wedding done, pick up supplies, be back by evening. Margaret's heart jumped at the prospect, excitement and nervousness mixing into something that made her slightly breathless. Tomorrow? So soon? No point waiting, John said, but his expression was gentle, understanding. Unless you need more time, we can wait if you're not ready. Was she ready? Margaret examined her feelings carefully. She was about to marry a man she'd known for less than a week, commit herself legally and permanently to a life vastly different from anything she'd experienced. It should terrify her. But instead, she felt a kind of calm certainty, as though every step of her life had been leading to this moment. "No," she said firmly. "Tomorrow is perfect. Let's get married, John Rowan, and make this official." His smile was brilliant, transforming his whole face. "Tomorrow, then. I'll warn you, though, I don't have a ring. Didn't think that far ahead when I placed the advertisement." "I don't need a ring," Margaret assured him. "I need a partner, and I already have that." John crossed to where she sat and knelt beside her chair, taking her bandaged hands carefully in his. "Margaret Vale, I can't promise you romance or pretty words or grand gestures. I can't promise that I won't sometimes withdraw into silence, or that I won't have days when grief still weighs heavy. But I can promise to respect you, to work beside you, to always be honest even when the truth is hard. I can promise to try my best to be the husband you deserve. Is that enough?" Margaret cupped his face with her bandaged hands, seeing past the weathered exterior to the good man beneath. "That's more than enough. And John, I promise the same. To respect you, to honor Sarah and Thomas's memory, to be patient when you need silence and speak truth when you need to hear it. To work beside you building something real. That's what I can give you, and I give it freely." He turned his head and pressed a kiss to her palm, right over the bandage, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. Then he stood, pulling her up with him, and for a moment they simply stood there, hands clasped, looking at each other with new understanding. "I should get to the barn," John said finally, but he didn't move. "You should," Margaret agreed, but she didn't let go of his hands. They smiled at each other, acknowledging the reluctance to separate even for an hour. Then John forced himself to step back. "When I return, we'll plan for tomorrow. What we need from town, what time we should leave, all the practical details. I'll have supper ready," Margaret promised. "And maybe I'll practice saying Margaret Rowan a few times, see how it sounds." "Sounds perfect," John said. And then he was pulling on his coat and heading out into the cold afternoon. Margaret moved to the window and watched him trudge through the snow toward the barn, his figure dark against the white landscape. Tomorrow, she would become his wife. Tomorrow, she would stop being Margaret Vale, Philadelphia seamstress, invisible and unnecessary, and become Margaret Rowan, Montana rancher's wife, partner in building a life. The transformation seemed almost magical in its simplicity. She turned from the window and surveyed her domain, the cabin that was becoming her home, the rocking horse in the corner bearing silent witness to the past, the fire crackling warmly in the hearth. She thought of Sarah and Thomas resting under the evergreens, of John slowly learning to live again, of her own journey from that cold train platform to this moment of certainty. Life had brought her here through storms both literal and figurative, but she had survived. And more than that, she had found purpose, belonging, the possibility of happiness. Tomorrow would seal it all with vows and witnesses, making permanent what her heart had already accepted. Margaret moved to the kitchen and began preparing supper, humming as she worked. The melody was an old Irish tune her mother used to sing, something about new beginnings and brave journeys. It seemed appropriate for the moment, for the life she was choosing, for the woman she was becoming. When John returned from the barn, stamping snow from his boots and bringing with him a gust of cold air, he paused just inside the door. "You're humming again." "I am," Margaret confirmed, not stopping. "Does it bother you?" "No." His voice was soft, almost wondering. "It makes this place feel like home." That evening, they planned for the next day over supper, discussing logistics and necessities. They would leave at dawn to take advantage of the daylight, John driving the wagon while Margaret bundled up against the cold. The journey to Copper Falls would take approximately 3 hours given the condition of the roads. They would go straight to the church to find Reverend Parker and handle the wedding first, then visit the general store for supplies before heading home. "Should I prepare anything special?" Margaret asked. "For the ceremony, I mean?" John shook his head. "Just be yourself. That's all I want, all I need. We'll say the words, sign the register, and that'll be that. Simple and honest. like everything else between us. Later, as they sat by the fire in the final hours before their wedding day, John pulled something from his pocket. I know I said I don't have a ring, and that's true. But I do have something, if you'll accept it. He opened his palm to reveal a small brooch, simple silver, formed into the shape of a wild rose. Margaret recognized it immediately from the pressed flower on the mantel. Sarah's? She asked quietly. Her mother's originally, then Sarah's. She wore it on our wedding day, said it was for luck and remembrance. John's voice was steady but emotional. I can't give you a fancy ring, but I can give you this. It's been passed down through her family, woman to woman, as a symbol of strength and endurance. Sarah would want you to have it, I think. Would want you to carry on the tradition. Margaret took the brooch with trembling hands. It was beautiful in its simplicity, worn smooth by generations of women who had loved and lost and carried on anyway. John, are you sure? This is precious, irreplaceable. I'm sure. You're family now, or will be tomorrow, and family shares what matters. He closed her fingers around the brooch. Besides, Sarah told me once that objects are only valuable if they're used, if they're part of living. She'd hate the thought of it locked away in a drawer, doing nothing, meaning nothing. She'd want it worn, treasured, passed on eventually to whatever children we might have. The mention of potential children made Margaret's breath catch. They hadn't discussed that possibility, hadn't gone beyond the immediate future. But hearing John speak of it so naturally, so hopefully, filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I'll treasure it, and I'll try to be worthy of the women who wore it before me. You already are, John said simply. They sat together in the firelight, hands joined, the brooch resting between their palms like a promise. Outside, the Montana night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the black sky. Inside, two people prepared to join their lives together, building on foundations of loss and hope, grief and healing, honest partnership, and the fragile beginning of something that might, given time and care, become love. Margaret thought about the next day, about standing in a small church and promising herself to this quiet, broken, healing man. She thought about the life they would build together, the challenges they would face, the moments of joy and sorrow that awaited them, and she felt for the first time in years truly ready, ready to be seen, to matter, to build something real, ready to become Margaret Rowan, ready to come home. That night, Margaret lay in bed, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, her mind racing with thoughts of tomorrow. She rose and moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit snow, and saw a light in the loft above the main room. John was awake too, both of them keeping vigil in their separate spaces, preparing in their own ways for the vows they would speak. Margaret pressed her hand against the cold glass and thought of Sarah, who had once stood in this very room, looking out at this same view. Thank you, she whispered to the ghost of a woman she'd never met. Thank you for loving him so well, for building this home, for giving me the chance to carry on what you started. I'll do my best by him, Sarah, I promise. The light in the loft flickered, and Margaret wondered if John was thinking similar thoughts, making his own promises to the past while reaching toward the future. They were both carrying ghosts tomorrow, his more literal than hers, but both real, both honored. It was right, Margaret thought. The past should be remembered, not erased. Sarah and Thomas would always be part of John's story, which meant they would always be part of hers, too. She returned to bed and finally slept, dreaming of wild roses and mountain snow, of silent men who slowly learned to speak and invisible women who found their voices. She dreamed of a small church and simple vows, of calloused hands joining together, of partnership and respect building something stronger than romance ever could. She dreamed of home. John, in the loft above, finally closed his book and extinguished his lamp. He lay in the darkness, thinking about the woman sleeping below, about the ceremony tomorrow would bring, about the future that suddenly seemed possible again. He thought about Sarah and Thomas resting under the evergreens, and he whispered his own promises to them. I'll always love you both. That won't change, can't change. But I'm going to try to live again, really live, the way you wanted me to, Sarah. Margaret is giving me that chance, and I'm going to take it. I hope you understand. I hope you approve. The cabin settled around him with its familiar creaks and sighs, and John felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years: peace. Not the absence of pain, but something deeper, a kind of acceptance. Sarah and Thomas were gone, and that would always hurt. But life continued, demanded to be lived, offered new chances and new beginnings if he was brave enough to accept them. Tomorrow he would marry Margaret Vale, and together they would forge something new from the pieces of their broken pasts. It wouldn't be the same as what he'd had with Sarah. It would be its own thing entirely, valuable in its own right. And that was not just acceptable, it was right. John closed his eyes and, for the first time since the fever took his family, looked forward to tomorrow with something approaching joy. Dawn broke crystalline and cold, the sky gradually lightening from deep purple to pale rose to the brilliant blue that promised clear weather for traveling. Margaret woke before the sun fully crested the mountains, her heart beating faster than normal, a mixture of anticipation and nerves making her hands tremble slightly as she dressed. She chose her best dress, dark green wool with simple black trim, practical but elegant, the most suitable thing she owned for a winter wedding. As she fastened the buttons with still tender fingers, she heard John moving in the main room, the sound of the stove being stoked, coffee brewing. The ordinary sounds of morning, but today they held extraordinary significance. When she emerged, John was standing by the window in clothes she'd never seen him wear. A proper suit, somewhat old-fashioned but well-maintained, the dark fabric making his shoulders seem even broader. He'd shaved carefully, his hair was combed back, and when he turned to look at her, Margaret saw vulnerability in his eyes that made her breath catch. "You look beautiful," he said simply, as though the words had been pulled from somewhere deep inside him. "You look very handsome," Margaret replied, and meant it. This was John transformed, the civilized version of the mountain man she'd come to know, and the combination was unexpectedly affecting. They ate a hasty breakfast, both too nervous for much appetite. Then John hitched Duke and Duchess to the wagon, while Margaret gathered her few belongings: the brooch pinned carefully to her dress, her mother's wedding veil wrapped in tissue and tucked in her bag in case she decided to wear it, and a strange feeling of weightlessness, as though she was about to step off a cliff into open air. The journey to Copper Falls began in near silence, both of them wrapped in their own thoughts as the wagon jolted over the frozen road. The storm had left the landscape transformed, everything softened and reshaped by snow, familiar landmarks made strange. But Duke and Duchess knew the way, and John guided them with practiced ease, his hands steady on the reins. About an hour into the journey, John finally spoke. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," Margaret admitted honestly. "And excited, and certain this is right, all at the same time. Is that strange?" "No." John's smile was small but genuine. "I feel the same way. Like I'm standing at the edge of something new, and I'm not sure if I remember how to take that first step, but knowing I have to try anyway." "We'll take it together," Margaret said, touching his arm lightly. "That makes it easier, doesn't it? Not being alone in it?" "It does." He covered her hand with his briefly before returning both hands to the reins. "Margaret, I want you to know something before we get to town, before we say the vows. I may not love you the way I loved Sarah, not yet, maybe not ever in quite the same way, but I care for you deeply already. You've brought life back to my home, hope back to my heart. And I'm committed to building a real marriage with you, not just a legal arrangement. I want you to know that." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I care for you too, John, more than I expected to in such a short time. And I'm committed to this marriage, to you, to the life we're building. Whatever comes, we face it together." They rode on through the morning, the sun climbing higher, the cold sharp but bearable. Margaret found herself studying the landscape with new eyes. This was her territory now, her home. She needed to learn its contours and secrets, needed to understand the land that would sustain them. John seemed to sense her thoughts and began pointing out landmarks, telling her about the creek that ran through their property, the best places to find wild berries in summer, the stand of timber on the north edge where he cut firewood each fall. "It's a good piece of land," he said with quiet pride. "Sarah and I chose it carefully. Good water, some flat ground for crops, timber for building and fuel, sheltered from the worst winds. Takes hard work, but it'll provide if you respect it." "Teach me," Margaret said. "Teach me everything you know about this place. I want to be a true partner, not just someone who keeps the house while you do the real work." John looked at her with an expression that was part surprise, part admiration. Most women wouldn't want to learn ranching. I'm not most women, Margaret reminded him yet again, and this time John laughed, a real full laugh that made her heart soar. No, you're definitely not, and I'm grateful for it every day. Copper Falls appeared on the horizon just before noon, a small cluster of buildings huddled against the vast Montana landscape like children seeking shelter. As they drew closer, Margaret could see people moving about despite the cold, the town going about its business, life continuing regardless of storms or personal dramas. She squared her shoulders, preparing herself for the scrutiny she knew awaited. John guided the wagon down the main street, and Margaret felt curious eyes following their progress. She kept her head high, her expression pleasant but not overly eager, neither ashamed nor defiant, simply a woman going about her business. John pulled up in front of the small white church, its steeple stark against the blue sky. "Ready?" he asked, setting the brake. "Ready," Margaret confirmed. They climbed down from the wagon, and John offered his arm with formal courtesy. Margaret took it, feeling the solid strength of him, and together they approached the church door. John knocked firmly, and after a moment the door opened to reveal a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a questioning smile. "John Rowan," the man said, surprise evident in his voice. "This is unexpected, and you must be Miss Vale. I've heard about you from the conductor." He stepped back, gesturing them inside. "Please, come in out of the cold. I'm Reverend Parker." The church interior was simple but well-maintained, wooden pews polished by years of use, a plain altar with a cross above it, winter light streaming through the clear glass windows. It smelled of wood polish and old hymnals, the scent of countless prayers and ceremonies. "Reverend Parker, thank you for seeing us," John said, his voice formal but warm. "We've come to be married, if you're willing to perform the ceremony." The Reverend's eyebrows rose. "Married? Today? That's rather sudden, isn't it, John?" "We've been snowed in together for nearly a week," John said bluntly. "It's time to make it proper and legal. Margaret came here to be my wife, and I intend to honor that agreement." Reverend Parker turned his attention to Margaret, studying her with sharp but not unkind eyes. "Miss Vale, this is a serious step. Are you certain you want to proceed? You've known John for less than a week. Marriage is a lifelong commitment, not something to enter into lightly." Margaret met his gaze directly. "Reverend, I'm 28 years old. I've spent years thinking about what I want in life, in a husband, in a partnership. I came to Montana with my eyes open, knowing exactly what I was choosing. John Rowan is an honest, decent man who needs a partner and who treats me with respect. That's more than most women get in a marriage. Yes, I'm certain." The Reverend's expression softened. "Well said, my dear. And you, John? Are you certain you're ready for this? It's only been 2 years since Sarah—" "I know exactly how long it's been," John interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "And I know Sarah wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my life alone, frozen in grief. Margaret understands what she's stepping into, understands that Sarah and Thomas will always be part of my story, and she's willing to accept that, to honor their memory while helping me build something new. That takes a rare kind of strength and generosity, Reverend. I'd be a fool not to recognize it." Reverend Parker was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. If you're both certain, then I'll perform the ceremony. But first, let me speak with Miss Vale privately for a moment. John, if you'll wait outside." John squeezed Margaret's hand and stepped out. The Reverend gestured for Margaret to sit in the front pew, and he settled beside her with a concerned expression. "Miss Vale, Margaret, I need to be sure you understand what you're undertaking. John is a good man, one of the best I know, but he's also deeply wounded. His grief runs profound, and there will be difficult days ahead. Days when he withdraws, when the memories overwhelm him, when you might feel like you're living with a ghost. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret considered her words carefully. "Reverend Parker, I'm not naive enough to think this will be easy. I know John is still healing, that he may always carry some of that grief, but I also know that healing happens better with someone beside you than alone. I'm not trying to replace Sarah or erase his pain. I'm trying to help him learn to live again, while building my own life in the process. We're partners in survival first, and maybe love will come from that foundation. Maybe it won't. But either way, we'll face it together, honestly and with respect. That's enough for me. The Reverend smiled, genuine warmth in his expression. You're a wise woman, Margaret Vale, wiser than your years would suggest. I think you and John might just make this work. He stood, offering his hand to help her up. Let's bring him back in and make you Margaret Rowan. John was pacing outside, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. When the door opened, he spun around, relief evident on his face. Everything all right? Everything's perfect, Margaret assured him. Shall we get married now? They re-entered the church, and Reverend Parker took his position before the altar. We'll need witnesses, he said. I'll fetch my wife, and perhaps we can find one more person quickly. He disappeared through a side door and returned moments later with a pleasant-faced woman who smiled warmly at Margaret, and behind her, to Margaret's surprise, came the train conductor who had brought her to Copper Falls. Mr. Henderson, John said, surprised. I didn't know you were still in town. Storm kept me here, the conductor replied, his weathered face creasing in a smile. Can't say I'm sorry about it, though, if it means I get to see this through. I was the one who brought Miss Vale to you, John. Seems fitting I should witness her becoming Mrs. Rowan. Indeed it does, John agreed, shaking the older man's hand. Thank you for being here. Reverend Parker opened his Bible, and suddenly the moment was upon them. Margaret and John stood before the altar, facing each other, their hands joined. The Reverend's wife and Mr. Henderson stood to the side as witnesses. Winter light streamed through the windows, illuminating the simple space with crystalline clarity. Dearly beloved, Reverend Parker began, his voice resonant in the small church, we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but deliberately and with reverence. It is a partnership of equals, a joining of two souls who choose to walk through life together, sharing its joys and sorrows, its triumphs and trials. Margaret listened to the familiar words, but her attention was on John, on his steady blue eyes fixed on her face, on his work-roughened hands holding hers carefully, on the slight tremor she felt in his fingers that told her he was as affected by this moment as she was. John Rowan, the Reverend continued, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Do you promise to love, honor, and cherish her in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? John's voice, when it came, was steady and sure, louder than Margaret had ever heard it. I do. And Margaret Vale, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Do you promise to love, honor, and cherish him in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? Margaret looked into John's eyes and saw past the present moment to the future they would build together, the challenges they would face, the life they would create, the possibility of happiness earned through partnership and respect. I do, she said clearly. Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana and by God above, I pronounce you husband and wife. Reverend Parker smiled. John, you may kiss your bride. John hesitated only briefly, then leaned down and pressed his lips to Margaret's in a kiss that was tender, careful, and full of promise. It lasted only a moment, but in that moment Margaret felt the full weight of what they'd just done, the binding together of two lives, the creation of something entirely new. When they separated, both were smiling. Mrs. Parker dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Mr. Henderson clapped John on the back with hearty congratulations. They signed the marriage register with the Reverend's pen, John's handwriting firm and clear, Margaret's smaller but equally certain. Margaret Rowan, she wrote, and the name felt right, felt like coming home. They emerged from the church into the bright afternoon as husband and wife, and Margaret felt transformed by more than just legal status. She was no longer the invisible seamstress from Philadelphia, no longer the spinster defined by what she lacked. She was Margaret Rowan, rancher's wife, partner in building a life, a woman with purpose and place. Word had spread quickly, as it did in small towns, and several people had gathered outside the church, curious, some friendly, some reservedly judgment. John kept Margaret's hand firmly in his as they faced the small crowd. A large woman in a practical wool coat pushed forward, her expression stern but not unkind. John Rowan, you might have told folks you were planning to marry. We'd have prepared something proper. It was a quick decision, Mrs. Hanson, John replied evenly, and we preferred it simple. Margaret, this is Mrs. Hanson. She runs the general store with her husband. Mrs. Hanson turned her formidable attention to Margaret, looking her up and down with the thoroughness of a customs inspector. So you're the one who answered John's advertisement. Philadelphia, I heard? Yes, ma'am, Margaret replied, meeting the older woman's gaze without flinching. Margaret Rowan now. Pleased to meet you. Mrs. Hanson's expression gave nothing away. Well, you've got courage. I'll give you that. Coming all this way to marry a man you'd never met. Either courage or desperation, and I suppose time will tell which. Perhaps it's both, Margaret said calmly. Courage and desperation often look alike from the outside, wouldn't you say? A flicker of something, respect maybe, or amusement, crossed Mrs. Hanson's face. Indeed they do. Well, Mrs. Rowan, welcome to Copper Falls. Stop by the store before you leave town. I'll put together some supplies as a wedding gift. That's very generous, thank you, Margaret said, genuinely pleased by the unexpected kindness. The crowd dispersed gradually, most people offering brief congratulations before hurrying back to their own business. A few women lingered, their expressions harder to read, and Margaret knew these were the ones who would be measuring her against Sarah's memory, looking for faults and failings. One woman in particular, elegantly dressed for frontier standards, stepped forward with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. John, how lovely to see you, and this must be your new wife. I'm Constance Miller, the doctor's wife. Sarah and I were dear friends, you know. I remember, John said, his tone polite but cool. Constance, this is Margaret. How do you do? Margaret extended her hand, which Constance took limply. I'm sorry I never had the chance to meet Sarah. From everything I've heard, she was a remarkable woman. She was, Constance agreed, her tone suggesting Margaret couldn't possibly understand. She set quite a standard for what a rancher's wife should be. I do hope you're prepared for the comparison that people will inevitably make. I don't intend to compete with a memory, Margaret said firmly. Sarah was Sarah, and I am myself. Anyone who needs to compare us will be disappointed, because I'm not trying to be her. I'm trying to build my own life here. Constance's smile grew even thinner. How modern of you. Well, I'm sure you'll learn our ways soon enough. Small communities have certain expectations, after all. And I expect Margaret will exceed them, John interjected, his voice carrying an edge Margaret hadn't heard before. Now, if you'll excuse us, Constance, we have business to attend to. He guided Margaret away firmly, and once they were out of earshot, she squeezed his arm. Thank you for that. She's always been difficult, John said. Jealous of Sarah, actually. Wanted to be the queen of Copper Falls society, such as it is. But Sarah was better liked, and Constance never forgave her for it. He paused, then added, You handled her well, better than I expected. I told you I survived 6 years of Philadelphia gossip, Margaret reminded him. Constance Miller is amateur hour compared to the society ladies back east. John's laugh drew curious looks from passers-by, but he didn't care. Come on, Mrs. Rowan, let's get those supplies and head home. The general store was warm and crowded with goods, barrels of flour and sugar, bolts of fabric, tools and hardware, medicines and sundries. Mr. Hanson, a tall man with a gentle demeanor that contrasted sharply with his wife's briskness, greeted them warmly. Congratulations, John. Mrs. Rowan, welcome to the family, so to speak. What can we help you with today? They spent the next hour selecting supplies. Flour, coffee, sugar, salt, dried beans, canned vegetables, a tin of real tea for Margaret. John added practical items they'd need for the ranch, while Margaret chose some fabric and thread, already planning curtains and small improvements to the cabin. Mrs. Hanson, true to her word, added several items as a gift. A jar of honey, a tin of cookies, and surprisingly, a small bottle of vanilla extract. For baking, she said gruffly when Margaret thanked her. A home needs the smell of fresh baking. Sarah knew that, and I expect you do too. I do? Margaret agreed, touched by the gesture. Thank you, Mrs. Hanson. This is very kind. As John settled the bill, Mr. Henderson appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. John, Margaret, I wanted to catch you before you left. Got something for you. He pressed a small package wrapped in brown paper into Margaret's hands. Just a little something. Open it later at home. And Margaret, I'm glad I brought you here. I think you're going to be just fine. The package tucked safely in her bag, they loaded the wagon and prepared to depart. The sun was already beginning its descent, and they needed to reach home before full dark. John helped Margaret up to the seat, then climbed up beside her, gathering the reins. As they pulled away from Copper Falls, Margaret looked back at the small town. Her town now, part of her new life. Some faces had been welcoming, others skeptical, still others openly hostile. But she'd survived the scrutiny, held her head high, and emerged as Margaret Rowan, a woman with a place and purpose. You did well, John said quietly as the town disappeared behind them. Better than well. You were perfect. I was myself, Margaret corrected. That's all I know how to be. It's all I want you to be, John assured her. He reached over and took her hand, holding it as he guided the horses with his other hand. Margaret Rowan, still getting used to the sound of it. Me too, Margaret admitted. But I like it. I like being your wife, John. I like you being my wife too. He squeezed her hand gently. Ready to go home, Mrs. Rowan? More than ready. The journey home took on a different quality than the journey out. They were returning as a married couple, bound legally and spiritually, committed to the future they would build together. They talked more freely now, sharing small observations and stories, John pointing out landmarks and Margaret asking questions about the ranch operations. As the sun touched the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the cabin came into view. Margaret felt her heart lift at the sight. This was home now, truly and completely hers. John pulled the wagon to a halt before the door and turned to Margaret with an expression she'd never seen before, tender, almost shy. There's a tradition, he said, about carrying the bride over the threshold. Would that be all right? Margaret's heart swelled. I'd like that very much. John climbed down and came around to her side, reaching up to lift her from the seat. She came willingly, letting him swing her down and into his arms. He carried her with surprising ease, his arms strong and sure, and kicked open the cabin door. Inside, he set her down gently, but didn't immediately release her. They stood in the doorway, arms around each other, looking at the space that was now undeniably theirs together. No longer John's cabin where Margaret was a guest, but their home, their future. Welcome home, Margaret, John said softly. Thank you, she replied, and reached up to cup his face. For everything, for taking a chance on me, for being patient, for being honest, for giving me a life worth living. Thank you, John echoed, for seeing past my silence, for bringing life back to this place, for being exactly who you are. He hesitated, then added, I know I said I might never love like I loved Sarah, but Margaret, I'm already starting to love you in a different way, a way that's just ours. It's not the same, but it's real, and it's growing stronger every day. Tears slipped down Margaret's cheeks. I love you too, John. I think I started loving you when you draped that buffalo hide over me in the wagon, caring for a stranger without expectation of anything in return. And I've been falling more in love with you every day since. He kissed her then, properly this time, without an audience or the formality of ceremony. It was a kiss that promised partnership and passion, respect and desire, a future built on honesty and hard work and the slow, steady growth of genuine affection. When they finally separated, both were smiling. Should unload the wagon, John said reluctantly. Should, Margaret agreed, making no move to step away. They laughed together and the sound filled the cabin with warmth. Finally, they forced themselves apart and set about the practical task of unloading supplies. Working together in the gathering twilight, they carried flour and coffee, fabric and tools, building their life one armload at a time. When everything was stowed and the horses tended, they returned to the cabin and Margaret lit the lamps while John built up the fire. The space glowed with warmth and light, transformed from the sparse, grief-stricken place Margaret had first entered into something alive and hopeful. I'm going to make us a proper wedding supper, Margaret announced. Nothing fancy, but something special. Let me help, John said, and together they prepared a meal, fried chicken from the cold box, potatoes with butter, the fresh bread Margaret had made days ago, and the honey Mrs. Hanson had gifted them drizzled over everything. They opened Mr. Henderson's package to find a small tin of peaches, a luxury that made Margaret gasp with delight. They ate at the table, passing dishes and talking about everything and nothing, plans for spring planting, improvements to the barn, whether they should get a dog, what they'd name their first cow-calf when Clover eventually produced one. Ordinary conversation about an ordinary life. But to Margaret, it felt extraordinary, precious, the kind of companionship she'd dreamed of but never quite believed she'd find. After supper, Margaret produced the vanilla extract and announced her intention to bake something for tomorrow. John watched her work with undisguised affection, and when she caught him staring, he didn't look away. "Just appreciating my wife," he said simply. "Your wife appreciates being appreciated," Margaret replied, and they grinned at each other like young people experiencing first love, which in a way they were. This was a first love for both of them, different from what came before but no less valuable. As the evening deepened, John added logs to the fire and they settled into their chairs. Their chairs now, no longer his chair and Sarah's chair, but chairs belonging to John and Margaret Rowan, partners building a life. John reached for Margaret's hand, and she gave it willingly. "Tell me something," John said. "Something you haven't told me yet, something about you I should know." Margaret thought for a moment. "I'm afraid sometimes. Afraid I won't be enough, won't know enough, won't be strong enough for this life. I'm afraid I'll disappoint you, or fail at something important, or—" "You won't," John interrupted gently. "Or maybe you will sometimes, because everyone fails occasionally. But Margaret, you're already more than enough. You faced down a blizzard, Mrs. Hanson, and Constance Miller all in 1 week. You've brought warmth and life back to a place that was dying from loneliness. You've honored my past while helping me build a future. That takes strength I didn't know existed." "Your turn," Margaret said. "Tell me something." John was quiet for a long moment. "I'm afraid too. Afraid of losing someone again, afraid of caring too much and having it torn away. For 2 years, I've been half alive, and it was safe because nothing could hurt me when I was already broken. But you've made me want to live again, really live, and that means risking my heart. It terrifies me." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Then we'll be afraid together, and we'll be brave together too. That's what partners do." "That's what partners do," John agreed. They sat in companionable silence, watching the fire dance, thinking about the day that had transformed them both. Finally, as the clock on the mantel chimed 9, John stood and helped Margaret to her feet. "It's been a long day," he said. "You should rest." Margaret looked toward the bedroom, then back at John, then at the ladder leading to the loft. She made a decision. "John, I'm your wife now, properly and legally. I don't expect anything you're not ready to give, but I'd like us to share a room, share a life completely, not with walls and floors between us." John's breath caught. "Margaret, I don't want to rush. We'll only do what feels right," Margaret assured him. "But I'd like to fall asleep beside my husband and wake beside him in the morning. Can we at least start with that?" He nodded slowly, emotion thick in his throat. Yeah, I'd like that too." They prepared for bed with a mixture of shyness and anticipation. John brought his few belongings down from the loft while Margaret changed into her nightgown in the bedroom. When she emerged, John was waiting, also in his nightclothes, looking uncertain. "I haven't shared a bed with anyone since Sarah," he admitted. I don't know what to—" Margaret took his hand and led him to the bedroom. "We'll figure it out together. That's what we've been doing all along, isn't it?" They climbed into bed from opposite sides, the space between them both small and infinite. Margaret could feel the warmth of John's body beside her, could hear his breathing in the darkness. After a moment, she rolled toward him. "John, would you hold me? Just hold me?" His answer was to pull her close, wrapping his arms around her and tucking her head beneath his chin. She fit against him perfectly, as though they'd been designed for exactly this. Margaret felt the steady beat of his heart, the rise and fall of his chest, the solid strength of him surrounding her. "This is nice," John murmured into her hair. "Really nice." "It is," Margaret agreed, already feeling sleep tugging at her. "John?" "Yeah?" "I'm glad I got on that train. I'm glad the storm trapped us together. I'm glad I answered your advertisement. I'm glad for all of it." His arms tightened around her. "Me too, Margaret. Me too." They fell asleep like that, wrapped together, two wounded people finding healing in each other's arms. And in the darkness, if the ghosts of Sarah and Thomas watched over them, it was with approval and blessing, understanding that love doesn't die but transforms, making room for new love without diminishing what came before. Morning came soft and gentle, Margaret waking to find herself still held secure in John's embrace. She lay quietly, not wanting to disturb him, watching the winter light creep across the ceiling. She thought about everything that had happened in the past week, the train journey, the blizzard, the slow building of trust and affection, the wedding yesterday. It seemed impossible that her entire life could change so completely in 7 days, and yet here she was, Margaret Rowan, held by a man who was learning to love again, building a home in the Montana wilderness. John stirred, his arms tightening briefly before he woke fully. "Morning," he rumbled, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning, husband," Margaret replied, loving the taste of the word. "Morning, wife." John pressed a kiss into her forehead, then another to her temple, then, with growing confidence, one to her lips. It was sweet and slow, a morning kiss between married people, and it promised a lifetime of such moments. When they finally rose and dressed, moving around each other with increasing ease in the small space, Margaret felt something settle deep in her bones, the certainty that this was right, that this was home, that this was where she was always meant to be. They prepared breakfast together, John teaching Margaret how he liked his eggs while she showed him the proper way to make tea. They talked about the day ahead, barn chores, unpacking the supplies properly, maybe starting on those curtains Margaret had planned. Ordinary things, domestic things, the building blocks of a shared life. After breakfast, as they cleaned up together, John caught Margaret around the waist and pulled her back against him. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For being brave enough to come here, for being patient with a broken man, for helping me remember what it means to be alive." He turned her in his arms so he could see her face. "For loving me." "Always," Margaret promised, "for as long as we both shall live." Outside, the Montana winter continued its reign, snow lying white and pure across the land. But inside the cabin, spring had arrived early in the form of two people learning to trust again, to hope again, to love again. The winter rancher's silence had been broken, replaced by the quiet conversation of partnership, the soft laughter of companionship, the growing warmth of affection transforming into love. Margaret had traveled across a continent to answer an advertisement for a bride. She'd found not just a husband, but a home, a purpose, a life worth living. And John, frozen in grief for 2 years, had found not a replacement for what he'd lost, but something entirely new. A partner who honored his past while building his future. A woman who saw through his silence to the man beneath. Together, they would face whatever came, harsh winters and difficult seasons, the challenges of ranch life, the judgment of small minds. But they would face it together, hand in hand, heart to heart, building something real and lasting from the wreckage of their separate pasts. The blizzard bride had melted the winter rancher's silence, and in doing so, had given them both a second chance at happiness. Not the same happiness either had known before, but something uniquely theirs, built on respect and honesty and the slow, steady growth of genuine love. And in the end, that was more than enough. It was everything. The two HTT www.youtube.com/watch VGEYZY40. Here's a cinematic 5-part American-style summary, 370 words, of mail-order bride arrived during blizzard, silent rancher, built her a cabin without saying a word. All character names are brand new for the CB project. The pacing follows a film-like rhythm: opening, rising action, climax, resolution, breakthrough, and ending, and the story ends completely, no continuation implied. Title: The Bride Who Melted the Winter Rancher's Silence. 1. Opening: The Blizzard Bride, Montana Territory, 1884. When Margaret Vale stepped off the last train before the storm, the wind bit through her city coat like knives. She'd answered an ad from a widowed rancher named John Rowan, A man who promised a roof, a future, and honest work. He appeared from the white squall, tall, broad-shouldered, a face carved from weather and sorrow. He said almost nothing, only lifted her carpetbag and murmured, "Storm's close." By the time they reached his cabin, snow erased the trail behind them. She realized she was truly cut off from the world, bound to a stranger who spoke with his hands more than his mouth. 2. Rising action. A cabin of quiet souls. John gave her the bedroom and slept in the loft. For 3 days, the blizzard trapped them inside, two ghosts of different worlds circling the same fire. Margaret cooked, mended, filled silence with small tasks. John split wood, fed horses, and watched her with wary eyes. When she thanked him, he simply nodded. But small things spoke louder than words. The way he draped the buffalo hide over her shoulders, the books of poetry stacked beside his veterinary manuals, the single photograph of a smiling woman and a grave-faced child. Widow and widower alike, they carried losses too heavy to name. 3. Climax. The storm inside. One night, the wind shrieked hard enough to shake the cabin. Margaret found John pacing, eyes haunted. "Storm like this took them," he said at last, his wife and son buried by fever and snow. "If it happens again," she touched his arm. "You didn't fail them. You built this place to keep others safe." He flinched, then exhaled. When he finally looked at her, his silence broke, not in words, but in the trembling hand that brushed away her tear. 4. Resolution. Spring in the snow. By dawn, the storm had died. Together they dug out the barn, laughing through frozen breath. When a beam cracked under the weight of ice, John rebuilt it before nightfall. Margaret stitched new curtains from her wedding dress scraps. Without planning it, they were remaking the cabin and each other. Bots. 5. Breakthrough and ending. The voice of home. When the thaw came, John hitched the wagon for town. "Preacher'll marry us proper," he said quietly. She smiled. "I thought you didn't believe in words." He met her eyes, voice rough but sure. "I do now." That evening, under a sky still rimmed with snow, they exchanged vows so simple they barely filled a breath. But in the hush that followed, the silent rancher's world finally sounded like home.